Welcome back, everyone, or if this is your very first time here, welcome. Pull your blanket a little closer, settle in, and let yourself breathe. Tonight we are not going anywhere stressful. We're just going to sit together in the quiet and let a really fascinating story find its way to you. Imagine this. The year is 1879. A gaslit city, London, the most powerful city on earth. Trains are running, telegraphs are humming, scientists are publishing theories that would shake the foundations of everything humanity once believed about itself. And yet in the drawing rooms of perfectly respectable English households, in the homes of lawyers, doctors, professors, and even members of parliament, people are gathered around a table in complete silence, with their fingertips resting lightly on the wood, waiting for a dead person to knock back. Now here is what nobody tells you. This was not the fringe. This was not the poor uneducated countryside. This was the educated elite of the most scientifically advanced civilization the world had ever seen, and they were deeply, completely unashamedly terrified of things they could not explain. Queen Victoria herself, the most powerful woman on the planet, would spend years trying to talk to her dead husband through a medium, a 14-year-old boy, and she believed every single word he said. So tonight we're going to ask a question that most history books never quite get around to asking why. Why were the Victorians the people who gave us modern medicine, modern infrastructure, and the theory of evolution? Why were they so haunted? What were they so afraid of? And what does that say about us right now? Tonight, still knocking on wood, still tossing salt over our left shoulder, still refusing to open an umbrella indoors. Because here is the secret hiding underneath all of it. We never really left the dark. We just got better lighting. If you are enjoying what you're hearing right now, I would genuinely love it if you hit the like button and subscribed. And if someone you know could use a good story tonight, share this with them. That kind of thing means more than you know. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love imagining the different corners of the earth where these stories travel. Now dim those lights just a little, let the room go soft around you, and let us begin. Let us start with something that sounds like a contradiction. The Victorian era, spanning roughly from 1837, when young Queen Victoria took the throne, all the way to 1901 when she died, is almost universally remembered as the age of reason, the age of progress, the steam engine, the telegraph, the expansion of railways. Charles Darwin publishing his theory of natural selection in 1859, the germ theory of disease, the discovery of electricity as a usable force in everyday life. In other words, science was winning. So you would expect superstition to be losing. And yet, and this is the part that historians find endlessly fascinating, exactly the opposite happened. The more modern life became, the more the Victorians clung to the supernatural. The more science explained, the more desperately people reached for something science could not touch. By the 1850s, an estimated 2 million Americans identified as spiritualists, that is, people who believed the living could communicate directly with the dead. The movement had crossed the Atlantic and swept through Britain, France, and Germany with the speed of a fever. By the 1860s, London alone had dozens of active spiritualist societies. There were spiritualist newspapers, spiritualist lecture tours, spiritualist academies. Seances were held in some of the finest homes in England, and none of this was hidden. That is what makes it so remarkable. The Victorians did not sneak off to practice their superstitions in shame. They debated them openly in newspapers. They wrote about them in letters. They invited their friends over for seances the same way we might invite someone to a dinner party. So what was really going on? Well, here is the part that actually makes sense once someone explains it to you. Victorian England was experiencing something genuinely disorienting. Think about what it must have felt like to live through that period if you were an ordinary person, not a scientist, not a philosopher, just someone trying to make sense of the world. In the span of a single lifetime, everything changed. Your grandparents had travelled by horse. You travelled by steam train at speeds that seemed physically impossible. Your grandparents had lit their homes with candles. You had gas lamps and soon electric light. Communication that once took weeks by letter now took seconds by telegraph. It was miraculous, and it was for many people deeply unsettling, because if invisible forces could carry a human voice through a wire thousands of miles away, and that was real, that was proven, that was science, then maybe invisible forces could carry something else, something older, something less easy to explain. The historian Owen Davies, who has written extensively about magic and superstition in Britain, has made this point beautifully. The new technologies of the Victorian age did not kill belief in the supernatural. They accidentally gave it new language. People started describing ghosts the way they described electricity, as a kind of energy, a force that lingered, a transmission that had not quite ended. And there was another factor, perhaps the most human one of all. People were dying. A lot. By modern standards, Victorian mortality rates were staggering. Infant mortality in many working-class neighbourhoods of London hovered around 150 deaths per 1,000 births. Cholera epidemics swept through cities. Tuberculosis, which the Victorians called consumption, was so widespread it touched nearly every family. Women died in childbirth at rates that seem unthinkable to us today. Grief was not occasional in Victorian life. Grief was constant. It was woven into the fabric of every single week. And when grief is that constant, when loss is that close, the human mind reaches for something. Anything that softens the unbearable reality that the people you love simply stop existing, and that more than anything else explains the seance. Not gullibility, not ignorance, not stupidity. Love. The desperate, completely human refusal to believe that love ends at death. Now it would be easy at this point to look back and feel superior, to say, well, we know better now. We have science. We have evidence. We do not sit around tables waiting for ghosts to knock. But, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, consider what we still do. We knock on wood when we say something we do not want to jinx. We toss a pinch of salt over our left shoulder when we spill it. We say bless you when someone sneezes, a habit rooted in the ancient belief that a sneeze could expel the soul from the body. We avoid breaking mirrors because 7 years of bad luck sounds terrible even when we know it is not real. We cross our fingers. We hold our breath going through tunnels. We send a chain message forward because something in the back of our mind whispers, what if? According to a survey conducted during the United Kingdom's National Science Week in 2003, 74% of the 2,000 participants said they believed in touching wood for luck. In a separate poll from 2007, 51% of British adults said they touched wood to ward off bad luck, and they did it regularly. Not as a joke, as a reflex. We're not as far from the Victorians as we like to think, and honestly I find that comforting rather than embarrassing. Because it means that throughout all of human history, across every civilization, every level of education, every era of scientific advancement, there has been this persistent, tender little voice inside us that says, be careful. Something might be listening, something might be watching, and maybe, just maybe, the people we have lost are not entirely gone. The Victorians listened to that voice very loudly. They built entire social systems around it. They developed rituals and customs and rules, hundreds of them, that governed every corner of life from the moment someone was born to the moment they died, and for a long time after. Rules about mirrors, rules about clocks, rules about what birds were flying over your roof, rules about which month you were allowed to get married in, rules about what to do if a stranger crossed your path during a funeral procession. And those rules came from somewhere. They came from real fears, real losses, real experiences that people had genuinely no other way to process. Here is something that a Victorian writer, a journalist writing in 1879, said about superstition in his own age. He wrote that it was strange in a time of such widespread education and enlightenment that superstition should still hold such power over so many minds. He noted how often people would deny believing in such things when asked directly, and then in the very next breath share a story of a death token or a prophetic dream with complete sincerity and barely concealed awe. People in 1879 were already noticing the contradiction, and we are still living inside it today. That is what I love most about the Victorians. They were not simpler than us. They were not less intelligent. They were in many ways achingly recognizable people caught between two worlds, between the old and the new, between faith and science, between the need to believe and the pull toward reason. They were us, just in better hats. Now here is where things get genuinely eerie, because the Victorians did not just believe vaguely in the supernatural. They built an entire extraordinarily detailed system of sign symbols and omens, a hidden language woven into everyday life that told them when death was coming. And some of these signs were in your home right now. In the next part of tonight's story, we're going to step inside a Victorian household on one of its darkest days. We're going to pull back the curtains quite literally and discover what happened when someone died and why the Victorians covered every mirror in the house, stopped every clock on the wall, and made absolutely certain the body was carried out feet first. Because they believed that if you got even one of those things wrong, something or someone would follow you home. Stay with me. So picture this with me for a moment. It is a Tuesday afternoon in London sometime in the late 19th century. A perfectly ordinary house on a perfectly ordinary street. And then quietly, without any warning, someone inside that house stops breathing. Within the next 20 minutes, something remarkable happens. Not the grief, not the weeping, not the neighbours arriving with food and murmured condolences. Something else entirely. Someone walks through every room in that house and stops every single clock. Not unplugs them, stops them. Freezes them at the exact minute that person drew their last breath. Then the mirrors, every mirror in every room, even the small one above the hallway table, gets covered in heavy black cloth. The curtains are drawn shut. The family photographs on the mantel are turned face down one by one, and then very deliberately the body's lifted and carried out the front door, but only feet first. Never head first. Never. And if you had asked anyone on that street why all of this was necessary, they would have looked at you with complete sincerity and said, "Because if you do not, something terrible will follow." That is where we are going tonight. Into the house, into the rituals, into the reasons. Let us start with the clocks, because I think the clocks are the detail that gets me most. There is something almost poetic about it when you sit with it long enough. Stopping every clock in the house the moment someone died was one of the most widespread Victorian customs, observed across social classes in working-class terraces and in grand manor houses alike. And it was not just one thing. It was several things at once layered on top of each other the way Victorian customs so often were. On the surface it was practical, it marked the exact moment of death, a timestamp for a world before official certificates were routine. But underneath that it was something far older. There was a widespread belief that a clock had a relationship with the life of the person in the house, that its ticking was somehow connected to the heartbeat of the living. To let the clocks keep running after a death was to invite bad luck into that same ticking rhythm. Some believed it would pull another family member toward death, as though time itself was still hungry and looking for someone new to count. And others, and this is the part that genuinely moves me, believed that stopping the clocks was an act of mercy, a way of saying to the person who had just died, time does not have to move for you anymore. You can rest now. We will hold it still just for a little while so you can find your way. Think about how tender that is. In the middle of grief, in the middle of chaos, someone walked through the house and gently stopped every clock. Not out of superstition, really. Out of love, wearing the costume of superstition. Now, the mirrors. This one goes deeper than most people realize. Covering mirrors after a death was not unique to Victorian England. Variations of it existed across Jewish mourning traditions in parts of Germany, in rural Ireland, in pockets of the American South. But the Victorians gave it a specific logic that was entirely their own. The belief was this: a mirror was not just glass. A mirror was a portal, and a spirit newly separated from its body and confused about what had happened might look into that glass and become trapped inside the reflection, unable to move on, unable to reach wherever it was supposed to go next, stuck essentially in the silver behind the glass, staring back at the living for eternity. The idea that you could accidentally imprison a soul in your bedroom mirror by not covering it fast enough is genuinely chilling to me, and I think it was genuinely chilling to them too. That is why they moved so quickly. That is why no mirror was left uncovered, not even the tiny ones, not even the decorative ones on powder boxes and vanity tables. But there was a second layer to the mirror superstition, even darker. If you were a living person, a healthy, very much alive person, and you happened to catch a glimpse of yourself in an uncovered mirror in a house where someone had just died, that was considered a serious death omen. Not bad luck. A death omen, meaning you might be next. Can you imagine you are visiting a grieving family? You glance sideways at the hallway mirror without thinking, and the person next to you quietly takes your arm and steers you away, and nobody says a word out loud, but everyone in the room has noticed and they are worried for you. That is the texture of daily life in Victorian England. Every surface had meaning, every reflection held a warning, and then there is the matter of carrying the body out feet first. This one actually has a beautifully logical explanation once someone explains it to you logical, by the internal rules of the belief system anyway. The idea was this: the dead in those first confused hours after passing still retained some connection to the world they had left. The spirit lingered near the body. It could see, and if the body was carried out head first, the dead person's eyes, still somehow aware, still somehow present, would be looking backward into the house they were leaving, looking at the rooms, looking at the family, and the fear was that the gaze of the dead turned back toward the living could act as an invitation, a silent calling, "Come with me." But carried out feet first, the dead face the direction of travel. They face forward, away from the house, away from the family. They cannot look back. And so the thinking went, they cannot beckon. One more detail that I find extraordinary in many Victorian households after the body had been taken away: the furniture in the rooms would be rearranged, chairs moved, tables shifted. The logic was almost practical in its superstition. If the spirit somehow managed to return, it would find nothing familiar. It would be confused. It would not recognize the room as its own, and it would leave again. The Victorians were not passive about their fear of the dead. They were strategic. Now, and I want to ask you something here, genuinely. Do you lock your car door when you drive past a cemetery? Do you hold your breath a little? Do you look away? Because I do, and I always have, and I did not grow up in Victorian England. There is something written into human instinct, I think, that still responds to that threshold between the living and the dead. The Victorians just had a much more elaborate vocabulary for it. Speaking of elaborate, let us talk about the death omens, because this is where things get genuinely fascinating. The Victorians did not just perform rituals after death had arrived. They spent a great deal of energy trying to know death was coming before it did. and they had a whole catalogue of signs. A sparrow landing on a piano inside a house was one of the most feared. Not a crow, not an owl, a sparrow. That small, ordinary brown bird sitting on the keys of a parlour piano meant in the Victorian imagination that someone in the household would die soon. And because so many Victorian drawing rooms had pianos, the piano was the centrepiece of respectable domestic life. This superstition touched nearly every family. A single snowdrop found growing in a garden before the rest of the flowers came up was another one. That delicate little white bloom pushing through the cold ground alone was read not as a sign of spring but as a sign of a coffin to come. The smell of roses when there were no roses nearby. An owl seen flying in daylight. 3 knocks on a door or wall when no one was there to knock. A dog howling at night in a house where someone lay sick. These were the death tokens, that actual Victorian phrase, death token, used in newspapers and letters and diaries as casually as we might say bad feeling today. And here is what I think is remarkable about that list. Almost none of those things are scary on their own. A bird, a flower, a smell, a sound. These are gentle, everyday things. But the Victorian imagination transformed them into an entire language of warning, quiet, natural signals from whatever lay on the other side of the threshold whispering, prepare yourself. Time is short. You could argue that is morbid. Or you could argue, and I genuinely find this compelling, that it was a way of making death feel less sudden, less arbitrary, less cruel. If you had enough warning, if you had read the signs, then maybe death was not an ambush. Maybe it was something you could meet with some measure of dignity. But perhaps no Victorian fear was more consuming, more raw, more visceral, more deeply embedded in the culture than this one being buried alive. I want you to really sit with what that phrase means. Not death, the thing that comes before death. The slow return of consciousness inside a sealed wooden box 6 feet underground with no light, no air, and no way out. The Victorians were obsessed with this fear. Not irrationally, there was real reason for it. Medical science in the 19th century was still in its early stages of understanding what death actually was. The stethoscope had only been invented in 1816. And for much of the century even trained physicians struggled to distinguish deep unconsciousness from death with any certainty. Cholera epidemics which swept through Britain and Europe multiple times during the Victorian period caused a particular problem. Cholera could produce a collapse so sudden and complete that the person appeared dead within hours, and the fear of contagion meant families were pressured to bury victims quickly. Very quickly. The result was a cultural nightmare. Edgar Allan Poe, whose stories were as popular in England as in the United States, captured this terror perfectly in his 1844 story, The Premature Burial. His narrator is a man so terrified of being buried alive that he redesigns his own tomb with escape mechanisms, padded walls, food and water within reach, and a bell rope connected to the surface. And the story was a sensation not because it felt like fantasy, but because it felt like a warning that we're already possibly too late. Poe's most chilling line on the subject still holds up. The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins? In the decades that followed, inventors and engineers took that fear and ran with it. More than 100 patents for what were called safety coffins were filed in the United States alone during the 19th century. The basic idea was the same, a cord or rope placed in the hand of the buried person running up through a tube to the surface connected to a bell. If the person woke underground, they could pull the cord. The bell would ring. Someone would come. In 1852, a man named George Bateson patented a device he called the Bateson Life Revival device. Essentially a small bell mounted above the grave with a rope running down into the coffin. It was so popular and the fear it addressed so widespread that Bateson received an honour from Queen Victoria herself. A German physician named Dr. Adolf Gutsmuth was so confident in his own safety coffin design that he had himself buried alive inside one for several hours to test it, and reportedly had soup, beer and sausages delivered to him through a feeding tube while he was underground, which is either the bravest or the strangest thing I've ever heard, and I am genuinely not sure which. Here is the heartbreaking footnote to all of this, though. Despite the patents, despite the fear, despite the bells and the ropes and the ladders built into coffin lids, there is no documented case of a safety coffin ever actually saving anyone's life. Not one. What the historical record does show instead is that the natural process of a body settling and shifting after burial would sometimes cause the cords to move on their own, triggering the bell, sending panicked gravediggers rushing to dig up a person who was in fact simply and completely dead. The bell rang. No one was saved. That is in a strange way the most Victorian thing of all. A society so afraid of death, so unwilling to accept its finality, that they built elaborate machines to fight it, and the machines could not help them. Because in the end, death came when it came, and all the bells in the world could not change that. What they could do, what all these rituals, all these omens, all these careful preparations could do, was make the living feel slightly less helpless in the face of it. And maybe that is enough. Maybe that has always been enough. There is something I keep coming back to as I read through all of this. The Victorians were not afraid of death in the way we sometimes are distantly abstractly, as something to be managed by professionals and kept out of polite conversation. They were afraid of it up close. They were afraid of it in their drawing rooms and their back gardens and their bedroom mirrors. They kept the bodies of their dead in their own homes for days surrounded by family. They watched. They waited. They performed ritual after ritual to hold the chaos at bay. And in doing so, they were, I think, more honest about death than we often are. They did not pretend it would not happen. They just built a whole ceremony around the fact that it would. Which brings me to something that nobody who studies this period ever quite expects to find. Underneath all the superstition, underneath all the ritual, what the Victorians were most terrified of was not the ghost. It was the silence of a clock that has stopped, the silence of a mirror turned to the wall, the silence of a room rearranged so the dead will not recognize it. All of that elaborate, careful, beautiful ritual, it was noise, human noise made against the silence of loss. And somehow in ways I cannot entirely explain, I find that the most human thing of all. Now just when you think you understand the Victorian relationship with death, just when you think you have mapped the whole territory, there is one more corner of it that most people never think to look into. Because while all these rituals were happening inside the house, something else was happening outside of it. In the drawing rooms of the wealthy and the parlours of the educated, in the private rooms of the most powerful households in England, including, as we will discover, the palace of the Queen herself, a completely different kind of encounter with the dead was taking place. Not omens, not rituals of protection, something far stranger, something the Victorians called spiritualism. And what happened when that movement took hold of Victorian society is genuinely one of the most extraordinary stories of the entire 19th century. Stay with me. There is a particular kind of unease that mirrors create in the dark. You have felt it. I am almost certain you have. That moment when you walk past a mirror in the middle of the night and your own reflection catches you by surprise, and just for a split second something cold moves through you. Something animal, something older than reason. You laugh it off immediately, of course. You are a modern person. You know what a mirror is. And yet, that flicker of unease, that instinctive flinch, it is not yours alone. It has belonged to every human being who has ever lived. And the Victorians, with their extraordinary talent, for turning everyday anxiety into elaborate belief, built an entire world of meaning around it. Tonight, we're going to follow the mirror all the way back to where that fear began, and I promise you, by the time we reach the end of this story, you will never quite look at your reflection the same way again. Let us start not in Victorian England, but somewhere much older. Because the thing that makes this story genuinely fascinating is that the mirror superstition did not begin with the Victorians. They inherited it. And understanding where it came from tells you something profound about what it means to be human. The ancient Greeks were among the first recorded civilizations to write about reflections with something bordering on spiritual dread. They believed that when you looked at your reflection, whether in a pool of still water or in polished metal, you were not simply seeing your face. You were seeing something closer to your soul, your inner self made briefly visible. And because the soul was precious, fragile, and in constant need of protection, the reflection carried real weight. Narcissus, that beautiful young man who fell in love with his own reflection in a stream and wasted away at the water's edge, was not just a story about vanity. It was a warning about the danger of gazing too long into your own soul, of getting lost in the self-portrait that looks back. The Romans built on this. When they developed polished metal mirrors and later early glass mirrors, they brought with them the Greek understanding that the reflection held something sacred, and they added their own layer, the belief that the body and soul renew themselves in cycles of 7 years. This was a widely held conviction in Roman thought that every 7 years a person's health, vitality, and spiritual essence were essentially reset. Which meant that if something disrupted that cycle, if something shattered the vessel that held your reflection, the consequences would echo for a full 7 years. Until the next renewal came around, this is where the superstition about breaking a mirror began. Not with careless housemaids, not with parlour gossip, with a 2,000-year-old understanding of the self as something cyclical, something fragile, something that could be damaged by breaking the object that dared to reflect it. The earliest written mention of broken mirrors bringing bad luck in English appears in 1777, but the belief itself was already ancient by then having travelled through centuries of European thought before landing in Victorian drawing rooms, and the Victorians, who were always extraordinarily good at taking old ideas and giving them new, theatrical clothing, wrapped this belief in layers of ritual and ceremony that made it feel more urgent than ever before. So here is the question I want to sit with for a moment. Why was the Victorian relationship with mirrors so particularly intense? There is an answer that most people never think about, and it lies in economics. Until the Industrial Revolution changed everything, a proper glass mirror was extraordinarily expensive. Not moderately expensive, genuinely out of reach for most ordinary families. The craft of creating a flat glass mirror with a clear, undistorted reflection required techniques that were jealously guarded secrets, concentrated in certain European cities, most famously Venice, for centuries. A high-quality mirror was not a household item. It was a status symbol. It was in many homes the single most valuable object in a room. Louis XIV of France installed the famous Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in 1684, hundreds of enormous mirrors lining a gallery designed to be the most dazzling room in the world. The message was not about decoration. The message was, I have so many mirrors that I can waste them on a corridor. That is the kind of power I hold. By the Victorian era, glassmaking had improved enough that mirrors were becoming more common in middle-class homes, but they were still significant, still objects people were careful around, still objects that carried a sense of weight and importance, practical and symbolic both. So when a servant dropped and shattered a mirror in a Victorian household, it was not just a bad afternoon. The cost of replacing it could represent months of wages. It was in a very practical sense a catastrophe, One theory about the 7-year bad luck superstition recorded by historians of this period is that it began partly as a way for wealthy households to impress upon servants just how serious a broken mirror was. 7 years of bad luck was not just a spiritual warning, it was a social threat. Be careful, be very, very careful with this. I find that detail endlessly interesting because it shows how superstition and social control have always been tangled up together. The fear of the supernatural doing the work that a stern employer's lecture could not quite manage. But I want to be honest about something because I think the purely practical explanation undersells what was actually happening. The Victorians did not just use mirror superstitions as household management. They believed them genuinely and sometimes desperately in ways that the cynical reading of history misses. And the belief that mattered most, the one that shaped behavior in a way that no practical concern about property damage could explain, was this. The reflection in a mirror was not just an image, it was a record. Many Victorians believed with complete sincerity that a mirror held a living imprint of every soul who had ever looked into it, that the glass preserved something of each person's essence. And because of this, a dying household, a house in mourning, a house where someone had just taken their last breath, became a place of genuine spiritual danger. The newly dead, it was believed, lingered near the body in those first hours and days. They were confused. They were still attached to the world they had left. And if such a spirit looked into a mirror, it would see itself reflected there and become trapped. Not gone. Not at peace. Caught between the living world and whatever came next, imprisoned in the silver behind the glass, unable to move forward. This is why the mirrors were covered, not just with any cloth with black crepe or heavy black veiling specifically. The same material used in mourning dress, in funeral wreaths, in the ribbons tied around door handles to signal a death to passers-by. The choice of black was deliberate. Black absorbed the reflection entirely, closed the portal, made the mirror into just a wall, and the covering had to happen quickly. This was not a ritual that could wait until a convenient moment. Families moved through the house within minutes of a death draping every reflective surface, the tall mirrors in the bedrooms, the smaller ones above, fireplaces, the decorative mirrors in hallways, even the glass faces of certain clocks. Because a spirit newly freed from its body might not realize what had happened yet, might still be looking, every mirror in the house covered, until the body had been carried out, until the burial was complete. Only then could the cloths come down. Only then was the mirror just a mirror again. Now there is a detail about this ritual that I find genuinely haunting, and I want to share it with you because I think it deserves to be said out loud. It was not only the spirit of the dead that people feared seeing in an uncovered mirror. It was their own reflection. The belief was this: if a living person caught a glimpse of themselves in a mirror inside a house of death, in a house where someone had recently passed, that reflection was contaminated, tainted by proximity to the threshold between living and dead, and seeing yourself in that tainted mirror was taken as a sign, sometimes even a certainty, that you would be next to go. Think about what that means for a moment. You're visiting a friend's home to offer your condolences. You're in grief, in shock, in that quiet rawness that comes with loss. The house is dark, the curtains drawn, and somewhere in the dim hallway you pass a mirror that someone forgot to cover. You see your own face looking back, and the person beside you takes a small, sharp breath, and no one says a word, because in that world, in that time, what just happened was not nothing. It was a sign, and everyone present understood it. I genuinely cannot decide whether that is terrifying or deeply achingly sad. Perhaps it is both. There is another strand of the mirror belief that I want to explore because it runs in a completely different direction, and it is one that most history books do not think to connect to the Victorian period. Have you ever heard that vampires cast no reflection? Of course you have. It is one of the most iconic details of vampire mythology immortalized in Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897. But that detail did not originate with Stoker. It came from much older Eastern European folklore from Romanian and Slavic traditions about the strigoi spirits of the dead that return to prey on the living. The logic of the no-reflection belief runs exactly parallel to the Victorian mirror superstitions, and I do not think that is a coincidence. If a mirror reflects the soul, if it captures something of the spirit of the person looking into it, then a creature without a soul, or with a cursed and malevolent soul, would have nothing for the mirror to capture. Nothing would appear. The glass would show the room, the furniture, the wallpaper behind where the creature stood and simply not show the creature itself. The mirror in this tradition was not just a reflective surface, it was a truth-teller, an incorruptible witness to the nature of the soul. Bram Stoker was not writing pure fantasy when he put that detail into Dracula. He was writing directly out of the lived superstitions of the Victorian age, an age that genuinely believed in drawing rooms and parlours across England, that what you saw in a mirror could tell you something about who or what you really were. The novel was published the same year that Queen Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, the height of the empire, the peak of rationalism and progress, and the book was a sensation not because it felt foreign and exotic, but because it felt close, because its fears were ones that Victorian readers already carried inside them. Let me ask you something, and I want you to actually pause and think about it. Do you have a mirror in your bedroom that faces your bed? Because there is a superstition still circulating today, still discussed on home design blogs and wellness websites, with complete earnestness that a mirror facing your bed while you sleep is dangerous. That in the darkness, when your consciousness is lowered and your defences are down, a mirror facing you becomes something more than reflective glass, something that watches. The Victorians would have nodded at that without any particular surprise. There are documented accounts from the 19th century of people who refused to sleep in any room where a mirror faced the bed, who would travel with their own small cloth specifically to cover the mirrors in hotel rooms before they could settle for the night, who woke from bad dreams convinced that whatever had visited them in their sleep had come through the glass. And I am not telling you those people were right, but I am telling you they were not alone. Not across cultures, not across centuries, not even now. Because that discomfort, that slight persistent feeling that a mirror in the dark is not entirely a neutral object that is one of the oldest things about us. Older than science, older than electricity, older than glass itself, stretching all the way back to the first human being who looked at their reflection in still water and felt for one uncertain moment that the face looking back might have its own intentions. The Victorians gave that feeling a name and a ritual and a whole language of protection, but they did not invent it. They just remembered it more faithfully than most of us do today. And in a house of death, in a room with the curtains drawn, and every clock stopped, and every mirror covered in black, the silence had its own sound. Not the ticking of time, something older, something that every human being who has ever lived has heard in the quiet and then quickly, carefully turned away from. All of this brings us to a question that kept me up genuinely late when I was working on this story. If mirrors could trap souls, and if seances could call the dead back to speak, then what exactly did the Victorians believe happened after death? What did they think was on the other side? Because the mirror and the seance table were not separate beliefs. They were two doors into the same room, and the room was the Victorian imagination of what death actually was, not an ending, but a transition. Not silence, but a different kind of conversation. And the story of how two young girls cracking their knuckles in a farmhouse in New York accidentally started a movement that swept through the most powerful households in England, including the palace of a grieving queen, is one I cannot wait to tell you. Stay right here. Right then. let me tell you about the night that changed everything. Not a battle, not a scientific discovery, not a political revolution. A farmhouse in upstate New York, a cold March evening in 1848. Two young girls who were bored and restless, and by their own account later in life deeply tired of being frightened by unexplained sounds that knocked and rattled through their wooden walls every night. So they decided to knock back, and in doing so, almost by accident, almost as a joke, they cracked open a door that an entire civilization walked through, a door that a grieving queen would walk through, a door that would eventually rearrange the spiritual lives of millions of people across 2 continents. It all began with an apple on a string. The Fox family had moved into their rented cottage in Hydesville, New York in December of 1847. The house already had a reputation locally. Neighbours spoke in lowered voices about strange sounds heard by the previous tenants, about rumours of a peddler who had gone missing, about a cellar that nobody liked to visit after dark. The Fox parents were methodical, practical people, Methodist churchgoers, not the kind of family that invited the supernatural for supper. But the sounds in that house were hard to explain away. Knockings and rappings and bangings that moved through the walls at night, that woke the children, that made the father get up with a candle and find absolutely nothing. Maggie was around 14 years old. Kate was closer to 11. 2 sisters in a farmhouse with long winters, very little to do in the evenings, and a mother who was by every account somewhat credulous and easily frightened. I am going to be honest with you here, the sisters started this as a prank. A childish, gleefully mischievous prank. First they tied an apple to a length of string and bounced it on the floor in the darkness, the thudding sound carrying through the thin wooden walls of the cottage in a way that made their mother go rigid with alarm. Then they graduated to dropping the apple outright. Then, as their skills sharpened with practice, they discovered something even more useful. If you pressed the joints of your toes against the floor in just the right way, if you flexed them with controlled tension, they could produce a sharp, clean knocking sound. Audible, distinct, seemingly sourceless. On the night of March 31st, 1848, Kate, feeling particularly daring, snapped her fingers at the darkness of the room and said in a voice just loud enough to carry copy this. And the knocking repeated her snaps exactly. Their mother, listening from the next room, went pale. She called out, "If there is a spirit here, knock twice." 2 knocks sounded from the wall. She asked, "How many children do I have?" And from somewhere in the dark, the correct number of knocks came back. The neighbours were summoned. The story spread, and within weeks a small farmhouse in an obscure hamlet of upstate New York had become the most talked about address in the northeastern United States. Here is the thing I keep turning over in my mind when I think about this story. The Fox sisters knew it was them. They knew from the very first night that they were the ones making the sounds. Maggie would say so herself decades later, in language so blunt it almost takes your breath away. She said it was a very common delusion. She said a great many people hear rapping and imagine at once that the spirits are touching them, but they also could not stop. And the reason they could not stop tells you something important, not about the sisters themselves, but about the world they were living in. Within days of that first night, the story had grown too large for 2 children to simply deflate by saying, "Actually, that was us cracking our toes." The neighbours were convinced. The local newspaper had published accounts. Adults, serious, sober adults, had come to sit in the parlour and heard the sounds and gone away transformed, certain that they had witnessed something real. And into this chaos stepped the sisters' older sister, Leah. Leah was 20 years older than Kate, sharp-minded, financially struggling, and possessed of what one historian later called a talent for recognizing the commercial potential of extraordinary circumstances. She looked at the situation her younger sisters had created, and she did not see a mess to clean up. She saw a business. Within months, Leah had moved Maggie and Kate to Rochester, set up a proper séance operation, and begun charging admission. $1 per person. The results were instant and spectacular. By November of 1849, less than 2 years after Kate had snapped her fingers in the dark, the Fox sisters were performing before a paying audience of nearly 400 people at Corinthian Hall, the largest venue in Rochester. Skeptics came expecting to catch them out. Investigators came to expose the trick. Scientists came to test their claims with measured instruments. Nobody could explain how they did it, and so overwhelmingly people concluded they were not doing it. Something else was. Now the question that I think we need to ask, because it is the question that history keeps shying away from, is this. Why did people believe not naive people, not uneducated people, not people who simply did not know better? Among the people who attended early Fox Sisters séances and came away convinced were Horace Greeley, one of the most influential newspaper editors in America; James Fenimore Cooper, one of the country's most celebrated authors; William Cullen Bryant, poet and editor; William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist. These were the sharpest minds of their generation, and they sat in a darkened room listening to two girls crack their toe joints, and they concluded they were hearing voices from the dead. Why, I think the answer is more complicated than fraud and gullibility, and more interesting too. The 1840s and 1850s were a period of extraordinary social upheaval in America. The Industrial Revolution was dismantling old certainties. Traditional religion was fracturing into dozens of competing denominations. The slavery debate was tearing the country apart in ways that the Civil War would soon make literal. Science was advancing at a pace that felt genuinely dizzying, and underneath all of that public noise there were a private grief that history rarely counts, the sheer constant relentless weight of losing people you loved, to illness, to accidents, to the 1,000 ways that the 19th century could take someone from you without warning. People lost children regularly. They lost siblings and parents and spouses in ways that modern medicine has largely made unthinkable. The séance offered something that neither science nor traditional religion could quite provide in that moment. It offered a conversation, not a sermon about what would happen after death, not a scripture about the resurrection, not a philosophical argument about the nature of the soul. A conversation, specific, personal. Where the dead appeared to know things only they could know, appeared to answer questions only they could answer, appeared to still be present in some form that you could reach. Can you understand why that was irresistible? I can. I genuinely can. The movement exploded. By 1853, the séance craze had crossed the Atlantic. Table-turning, the practice of gathering around a table, placing hands flat on its surface, and watching it rock and tilt as though moved by invisible forces, had become a fashionable drawing-room activity in London, Paris, and Berlin. By the mid-1850s, an estimated 2 million Americans identified openly as spiritualists. Hundreds of new mediums emerged, each claiming abilities equal to or exceeding those of the Fox sisters. Spiritualist newspapers were founded. Spiritualist societies were established across England. There were spiritualist lecture tours, spiritualist academies, a whole infrastructure of belief built with remarkable speed around the original act of two children frightening their mother with an apple on a string. And then came the moment that elevated spiritualism from a movement into something approaching a social institution. In December of 1861, Prince Albert died. Queen Victoria was 42 years old. They'd been married for 21 years. She adored him genuinely, unusually adored him in a way that was not particularly fashionable among royalty, where marriage was typically an arrangement rather than a love story. She wore black for the rest of her life. She slept with a cast of his hand beside her in bed. She had the servants lay out his clothes each morning as though he might still dress. She kept his shaving basin filled with fresh water every day until she herself died 40 years later, and according to accounts from that period, she sought him out through mediums. There is a story widely circulated, impossible to fully verify, and entirely consistent with everything else we know about Victoria's grief, involving a young medium named Robert James Lees, who was 13 years old when he first reportedly contacted the spirit of Prince Albert in a private sitting for the Queen. The account holds that Lees addressed Victoria by a pet name that only Albert had ever used for her, a name that no one outside the marriage could have known. Victoria was convinced. She reportedly wept. She said she would have this young man come to the palace. Whether this specific episode happened exactly as it has been told, I genuinely cannot say with absolute certainty. What I can say is that Victoria held séances in Buckingham Palace after Albert's death, that she was deeply interested in spiritualism, and that the image of the most powerful woman in the world sitting in a darkened room asking for her dead husband, that image tells you everything you need to know about the emotional depth of what spiritualism was offering to people. Not superstition, relief. Back in America, the Fox sisters were not faring quite so well. The life of a famous medium, it turned out, was not particularly gentle. Maggie fell in love with Alicia Kane, a celebrated Arctic explorer, who was certain the sisters were frauds, but could not help being charmed by Maggie anyway. Kane spent months trying to prove how the sounds were made. He openly said he believed it was a trick. He also proposed marriage. Maggie accepted. He died in 1857 before they could properly marry, leaving her financially ruined, emotionally devastated, and with no way back. She returned to mediumship out of economic necessity. She began drinking. Kate was drinking too. Both sisters were being slowly consumed by the machinery of something they had set in motion as children and could no longer control. Leah, the older sister, who had built the whole enterprise, had by now married a wealthy Wall Street banker and largely removed herself from the disreputable work of actual séances. She lived comfortably. She looked down on her younger sisters in public. She criticized Kate's drinking. She suggested that Kate was an unfit mother and threatened to have her children taken away. That was the wrong thing to do to Maggie Fox. On October 21st, 1888, the New York World newspaper ran a front-page story headlined "Spiritualism Exposed. The Fox sisters sound the death knell of the mediums." That evening, Maggie walked onto the stage of the New York Academy of Music before an audience of 2,000 people. She was wearing black. She was 54 years old. She looked, by accounts from people who were there, both exhausted and electric. She removed her shoe. She placed her foot flat on a wooden board that had been placed on the stage for the purpose, and in the silence of a theatre holding 2,000 people, a sound rang out across the hall, a sharp repeating knock clearly audible to everyone in the room, produced entirely by the movement of her toe joints against the board. 3 doctors came up from the audience and held her foot while she demonstrated. The sound continued. She said, and I'm going to read her words exactly as she gave them because they deserve to be heard. My sister Katie and myself were very young children when this horrible deception began. We never thought it would go so far. The press called it a death blow to spiritualism. The spiritualist said Maggie was drunk, bitter, being paid lying to spite Leah, recanting the truth to protect the movement. And the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible thing, they were right that she had been paid. A reporter had offered her $1,500 for the exclusive, and Maggie, who was broke and grieving and furious at her sister, had taken the money. But she had also been telling the truth, and a year later, facing destitution and pressure from the movement she had just tried to destroy, she recanted. She said it had not been a hoax after all, that her spirit guides had told her to take it back. She died in 1893, 5 years later, destitute and largely forgotten in a friend's house in Brooklyn. Kate had died 8 months before her the same way. Leah had died 3 years before, both of them wealthy and respectable and unconcerned. And here is the detail that I find the most extraordinary of everything in this story. Even after the confession, the spiritualist movement continued to grow. By the time Maggie stood on that stage and cracked her toes before 2,000 people, there were millions of confirmed spiritualists around the world. New mediums with more spectacular abilities, mediums who could levitate tables, produce written messages from spirits, apparently materialize full physical forms in darkened rooms, had long since emerged. The Fox sisters, in a very real sense, had made themselves redundant. The movement had grown past its founders, swallowed their confession whole, and kept moving. The Spiritualist Association of Great Britain had been founded in 1872. The National Spiritualist Federation followed in 1890. The Spiritualist National Union in 1901. These were not fringe organisations. They were institutions with publications and membership rolls and regular meetings in respectable buildings. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who created Sherlock Holmes, the world's greatest rational mind, was a devoted spiritualist who believed absolutely and spent a significant part of his later life evangelizing for the movement. He wrote a full history of spiritualism. He attended séances. He believed that the Fox sisters' confession was itself a fraud coerced by a hostile press. The man who invented the archetype of pure cold reason spent his evenings in darkened rooms asking dead people questions. I find that less ironic than most people do, because I think what Conan Doyle understood, what everyone who ever sat at a séance table understood, from grieving factory workers to grieving queens, is that the desire to talk to someone you have lost is not a lapse in rationality. It is the most human thing there is. And this is where I want to leave you for a moment with a question that I have been sitting with since I started working on this story. If two children cracking their knuckles in a farmhouse bedroom could convince millions of people across 2 continents that the dead were speaking to them, what does that tell us about what people desperately needed to hear? The answer is not that the Victorians were foolish. The answer, I think, is that grief makes us reach, all of us, across every century, across every level of education, across every scientific advancement humanity has made. When we lose someone, we reach. And the Fox sisters, whatever else you can say about them, and there is plenty to say, they gave millions of grieving people something to reach toward. That is a strange legacy for 2 children who started by tying an apple to a string on a cold night in upstate New York. Strange, and more than a little heartbreaking. Now, while all of this was playing out on the public stage, the séances, the mediums, the packed theatres and converted queens, something equally remarkable was happening in the private homes of ordinary people across Victorian England. Because not everyone who believed in the supernatural went looking for a professional medium. Some of them hid things in their walls, under their floorboards, beneath their hearths and chimneys, and those hidden objects still being found today, still turning up in the walls of houses when people renovate old buildings, reveal a completely different face of Victorian superstition. Not grand and theatrical and public, but quiet, domestic, fiercely personal. What they buried and why, and what they believed those objects would do for them, that is coming up next. Something happened recently that I have not been able to stop thinking about. A renovation crew in Cliftonville, Kent, prying up old floorboards in what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary Victorian house, pulled back a warped plank and found something sealed beneath it. Not a coin, not a forgotten letter. A glass bottle, tightly corked, packed with iron pins and what appeared to be animal bone. The archaeologists recognized it immediately. Not a medicine bottle, not a forgotten relic from a builder's lunch. Something far more deliberate, something placed there by a person who believed with absolute sincerity that it was the difference between their family being safe and their family being well. not safe. And here is the thing that genuinely startles me every time I encounter this story. That bottle had been sitting beneath those floorboards for over a century. The family that placed it there had long since lived and died and been forgotten by history. But whatever they feared when they sealed that bottle and pressed it into the earth beneath their home, that fear was preserved. It outlasted them. It outlasted the memory of their names. And when those floorboards came up in the 21st century, that ancient, earnest, very human act of protection came with it. Tonight, we are going inside the Victorian home. Not the grand rooms that people showed to visitors, not the parlour with its careful arrangements and its covered mirrors. We're going into the walls, into the hidden spaces beneath the floorboards, into the everyday life of ordinary families who lived inside a web of invisible rules and invisible protections that most of their modern descendants have completely forgotten. Let us begin with shoes, because shoes, of all the things you might expect to find hiding inside the walls of a 19th century house, are far and away the most commonly discovered objects. The Northampton Museum in England, which has been quietly collecting reports of these finds since the 1950s, maintains what they call the Concealed Shoe Index. By 1998, that index contained more than 1,100 entries. By 2012, it had grown to nearly 1,900, almost half of which date specifically from the 19th century. The museum's collection now holds records from over 3,000 individual shoes recovered from hidden locations in buildings across Britain, with similar finds documented in the United States, Canada, Australia, and parts of Europe. 3,000 shoes hidden in walls, beneath floorboards, tucked into chimneys, secreted above ceiling beams, placed in the dark spaces beside doorways and window frames, the threshold points of a house, the places where the outside world passes through. The oldest known example dates to 1308, found at Winchester Cathedral. But the practice clearly continued and even intensified well into the Victorian period, precisely the era we tend to think of as the most rational, the most modern, the most progressive. Now, why would anyone hide a shoe in their wall? The short answer is protection. But the longer answer is considerably more interesting, and it tells you something profound about how the Victorian mind understood the relationship between the physical world and everything that lay beyond it. Shoes in British folklore were not ordinary objects. They were objects that carried the shape of a person. Think about that for a moment. A well-worn shoe, especially an old, soft leather shoe that has been worn for years, conforms exactly to the contours of the foot that lived inside it. The pressure points the angles, the subtle individual variations of how a particular person stands and walks. All of that is pressed permanently into the material. In a world without photographs, without fingerprints, without any of the technologies we use to identify individuals today, a worn shoe was one of the most specific, most personal objects that existed. And if the shoe carries the shape of the person the thinking went, then it carries something of the person's essence, their spirit, their presence. There were two main theories about what this meant for protection. The first, the shoe acts as a decoy. A malevolent force, whether a witch, an evil spirit, or something less easy to name approaching the house, would encounter the spiritual imprint of the person in the shoe, mistake it for the actual person, and attack the shoe instead. The evil would be drawn in trapped, and the living human inside the house would be untouched. This is why the shoes are always placed at the vulnerable spots, chimneys, doorways, the spaces beneath thresholds, the places where something harmful might enter. The second theory runs in a slightly different direction. The shoe acts as a guardian. The spiritual presence trapped inside it watches over the threshold it protects. The person is no longer in the house, but their essence remains standing guard at the point of entry, as constant and as patient as the walls themselves. And here is the detail that genuinely moves me about this. Almost always the shoes are worn-out ones. Old shoes, Shoes at the end of their useful life. Someone sat down with a shoe that could no longer be worn, that had been shaped by years of someone's walking, and they thought, this still has a purpose. This can still do something, and they pressed it into the wall of their home and left it there. There is a kind of tenderness in that act that I find hard to put into words. Now you might think this was purely a countryside custom, a rural tradition, something that educated city people had moved past. But the Concealed Shoe Index tells a different story. The shoes have been found in London townhouses, in Edinburgh tenements, in the walls of buildings in Birmingham and Manchester, in a house in Hydesville, New York. Yes, the very same town where the Fox sisters would later launch a movement that shook the world. 44 shoes and boots were discovered during renovations of a colonial-era building in the 1980s. 44. This was not a fringe practice. It was not something people did quietly in shame and concealment, hoping the neighbours would not find out. It was something ordinary, something that builders and homeowners did as a matter of course, the way we today install a security system or bolt our locks. The names of the families who placed those shoes are almost entirely lost to history. But their quiet act of hope is still there, pressed into the bones of the buildings they lived in. Let me ask you something. Has anyone ever renovated an old house in your family? Pulled up floorboards, knocked down a wall, opened up a chimney that hadn't been used in decades? Because if they have, there is a small but genuinely non-trivial chance that something was found in there. An old bottle, a worn shoe, a small bundle of objects tied together with string. And if someone did find something like that, the question was probably, what do we do with this? Most historians who study this area put it back. Not because they believe it, not because they think they need to, just because, well, it was put there for a reason, and it felt wrong to throw it away. That instinct alone, I think, tells you something important about how deeply these things are embedded in us. Even when we have consciously left the belief behind, we find we're not quite comfortable dismantling the protection someone else put in place. But hidden shoes were only one layer of the domestic protective system that Victorian families maintained. Far stranger and far more viscerally unsettling were the witch bottles. A witch bottle was exactly what it sounds like, and also nothing like what the name initially suggests. It was not a bottle that belonged to a witch. It was a bottle made against one. The practice of making witch bottles stretches back at least to the 17th century in England, possibly earlier, but it continued robustly into the Victorian period in rural areas, and was, according to folklore researchers, still being practiced in some parts of England well into the early 20th century. More than 200 intact examples have been found by archaeologists, and the contents of these bottles are, there is no other way to put this, genuinely remarkable. The most common recipe went something like this. You took a ceramic or glass bottle. You filled it with bent iron pins and nails. The bending was important as it was believed to neutralize the pins in a ritual sense, allowing them to exist in the space between the physical world and the spirit world. You added something personal, hairnail clippings, a scrap of fabric from your own clothing, and then, and this is the part that tends to provoke a strong reaction when I tell people, you added urine, your own urine, fresh and as much of it as the bottle would hold. The bottle was then sealed, buried beneath the hearth or beneath the threshold of the house and left there. The logic was this: the sympathetic connection between the bottle's contents and the person they belonged to meant that whatever happened to the bottle would happen to the witch who had cursed that person. The bent pins would cause the witch pain. The iron would trap and confuse her. The urine, which was understood as deeply connected to the person's physical essence, would draw the witch's curse into the bottle like a magnet where it would be safely contained. In 2016, English Heritage examined a witch bottle found beneath a Victorian-era building in London, using modern X-ray technology. The results confirmed bent nails and pins, what appeared to be hair and nail clippings, and residue consistent with human urine that had long since dried. Someone at some point in the 19th century made exactly this object and placed it beneath their floor. Not in the distant past, not in the medieval darkness before science existed, in the Victorian era, while trains were running, while Darwin was publishing, while the telegraph was carrying messages across continents. And they put it there because they were frightened, and because this was what you did when you were frightened, and because it had worked for someone else once and you clung to that. Outside of the walls and beneath the floorboards, the everyday life of a Victorian home was governed by a web of smaller, quieter superstitions that touched almost every ordinary action. Some of them still live in us today, though we have long since forgotten why. Take shoes on a table. Ask almost anyone in Britain or in regions of America settled by British and Irish immigrants whether it is unlucky to put shoes on a table, and a remarkable number of people will say yes. Many of them cannot tell you why. They just know it feels wrong. Their grandmother told them. Her grandmother told her. And somewhere further back, the origin of the feeling was this. In the mining communities of northern England, when a miner died at work, and in the 19th century mining was catastrophically dangerous, killing men by the hundreds, every year his boots would be brought home and placed on the table. It was an act of tribute. A way of saying this man's work is done. His shoes rest now. And so shoes on a table became by association a sign that death had entered the house. Doing it carelessly, setting your boots down on the kitchen table without thinking, was to invite that same association, to whisper to fate a person has died here. The superstition spread out of the mining districts and became a general British belief carried across the Atlantic, by immigrants embedded in families passed down through generations. Nobody in your grandmother's kitchen was necessarily thinking about a dead Victorian miner when she told you to get your shoes off the table immediately. But he was there in the background, quiet and invisible, having travelled forward through time on the force of one family's grief. There were dozens of rules like this inside the Victorian home. Putting on a garment inside out was actually good luck, but you had to leave it that way for the rest of the day, because turning it right side out again would reverse the fortune. Rocking an empty cradle was a sign that a baby was on the way, useful information, perhaps, though the mechanism was left unexplained. Giving a knife as a gift was dangerous because it cut the friendship, unless the recipient gave a coin in return, so the transaction became a purchase rather than a gift. Two people reaching for the same object at the same time, a wishbone, a doorknob, would make a wish, and neither should speak until the wish was answered. A single white hair found on a dark coat was lucky. A spider found in your house, especially in autumn, should never be removed, because the spider was bringing money to the household, and disturbing it would drive the money away. This last one, I suspect, has had genuine consequences for the spider populations of Victorian England that nobody has properly studied. Putting on the right shoe before the left was important, the right side being associated with good fortune, the left with its opposite, a belief that stretches back through Roman custom and Christian theology. Both the left always the side of darkness, the side where the devil stood at your shoulder. If you put your left shoe on first accidentally, you'd already started the day in the wrong direction, and the best thing you could do was take both shoes off, put the right one on first, and begin again properly. The first person you met when you left your house in the morning set the tone for the entire day. Meeting a barefoot woman crossing your path before noon was serious bad luck, serious enough that some men would turn around and go back home to let the omen pass. Meeting a red-haired person was also unfortunate, though. What the red-haired person thought of this arrangement has not been well recorded. Now here is the thing I keep coming back to when I sit with all of this. These domestic superstitions were not separate from everyday life. They were woven through it stitch by stitch, in a way that made the invisible world feel immediately practically relevant. Every morning when you put your shoes on, you were participating in something older than you. every spider you chose not to disturb every knife you carefully avoided giving without a coin. In exchange, these were small acts of attention to a world that you understood to be more complex and more dangerous than it appeared on the surface. I think we sometimes look back at this and feel superior. We have science, we understand spiders, we know there is nothing in the wall. But I wonder sometimes whether what we have gained in certainty we have lost in attention. The Victorians paid attention to their houses in a way that most of us simply do not. They noticed where the draught came from. They knew which corner of the hearth was coldest. They understood the sounds their buildings made in different weather, and layered on top of that practical attention was a spiritual attention, a sense that the house itself was alive in some way, that it participated in the fortunes of the family that lived inside it. You can call that superstition. You can also call it care. Which brings me to something that I find quietly remarkable about all of these domestic practices now that I have spent so much time with them. The hidden shoe, the witch bottle, the rules about shoes and knives and spiders, none of these were about grand public beliefs. Nobody was debating them in Parliament. Nobody was writing philosophical treatises about them. They were just the things you did quietly in your own home to keep your family safe. They were the private faith underneath the public world. And in a century that was loudly arguing about the nature of God and the origins of humanity, and the limits of science, those private acts of protection, pressed into walls, sealed into bottles, encoded into the simple rules of how you dressed in the morning, were the quietest and perhaps the most persistent form of belief of all. The kind of belief that does not need to be spoken to survive. The kind that is just passed hand to hand through ordinary life until it is part of the grammar of how a family moves through the world. But if the home was full of hidden protections, if every threshold and chimney and floorboard was quietly working to keep something out, what exactly were Victorian families protecting themselves from? And the honest answer is many things. Witches and evil eyes and wandering spirits, yes. But also illness. Also bad weather. Also the specific grinding anxiety of being alive in a century where so much was changing so fast that the old maps no longer quite showed the territory. In the next part of our story, we move outside the house and into the natural world, because the Victorians did not just read their homes for signs. They read the sky, the birds, the behaviour of animals, the phases of the moon. They had an entire language of natural omens that governed everything from whether to plant a garden, to whether to begin a journey, to whether this particular Monday was a day you could safely leave the house at all. And some of what they read in those signs was genuinely beautiful. Stay with me. Of all the days in a person's life that the Victorians considered worth protecting, worth hedging with ritual, with careful timing, with layers upon layers of symbolic armour, there was one day that dwarfed all others, the wedding day. Not because it was the happiest, though it was supposed to be, but because it was the most exposed. A marriage in the Victorian imagination was a threshold event in the truest sense, a moment when two lives crossed from one state of being into another, when the boundaries between families shifted and reformed, when the future suddenly became something you could almost touch. And any threshold, as we have already seen, was a place of danger, a place where things could go wrong in ways that no amount of careful living afterward could entirely undo. So the Victorians brought every tool they had, and some of what they built around that one day is still sitting in your life right now today, in traditions you follow without the faintest idea why you follow them. Let us find out where they came from. We have to begin with the month of May. Because May, golden blooming flower-scented May, the month that most of us would instinctively choose for an outdoor celebration, was in the Victorian world the single most feared month to get married in. The rhyme was simple and devastating in its certainty: marry in May and you will surely rue the day. This was not a polite suggestion. It was for many Victorian families an absolute prohibition. Historical records from the period show that May was consistently the quietest month for marriages in England. In churches across the country, the spring diary would fill with weddings in April, then empty almost completely in May, then fill again in June. Couples who planned weddings in May faced real pressure from their families to reconsider. Queen Victoria herself, who held strong views on many things, is reported to have forbidden her own children from marrying in May. The advice was taken seriously at every level of society. But where did this fear come from? The answer travels back further than most people expect. In ancient Rome, May was the month of Lemuria, a solemn festival for the appeasing of restless spirits, for the honouring of the dead, for the performance of rituals designed to prevent the recently deceased from wandering back into the houses of the living. It was a month of mourning and propitiation, not of celebration, certainly not of new beginnings. The Romans were emphatic joy, and mourning did not mix, and to begin a marriage during Lemuria was to begin it under the shadow of death. That belief made its way through centuries of European Christianity, was reinforced by the medieval church, and arrived in Victorian England so deeply embedded that almost nobody could explain it anymore. They just knew May was dangerous. The meaning of Lemuria had been forgotten for 1,000 years, but the fear it created was still there, riding forward through time on the force of habit and rhyme. This is one of the things I find most extraordinary about superstition. The way a belief can outlive every single reason for the belief can survive the complete disappearance of the civilization that created it, and still shape the behaviour of people who have never heard of the original idea. The Victorians who avoided May weddings were obeying a Roman calendar they knew nothing about. And by the way, if you have ever felt vaguely uncomfortable about the idea of a May wedding, even though you cannot explain why you have just discovered that you are approximately 2,000 years old in your instincts, the month mattered, but so did the day. And this is where Victorian wedding superstition gets delightfully specific. There was a rhyme widely known, widely recited, and taken with complete seriousness that assigned a destiny to each day of the week. Monday for health, Tuesday for wealth, Wednesday the best day of all, Thursday for losses, Friday for crosses, Saturday for no luck at all. Read that one more time slowly. Saturday for no luck at all. Saturday is, of course, the most popular day for weddings in the modern world. The most convenient, the most practical, the one most guests can attend without taking time off work. Across the entire Western world, more weddings happen on Saturday than on any other day. And according to Victorian English folklore, it was the worst possible choice you could make. Now there were practical reasons buried inside the belief. Wednesday was genuinely the best day in many agricultural communities because it left the rest of the week for recovery and for work to resume. Saturday weddings, on the other hand, led directly into Sunday, the Lord's Day, a day of rest which meant any problems arising from the wedding had to wait an entire extra day before they could be resolved. The superstition carried a practical core the way so many superstitions do before it hardened into something that felt like absolute law, but the Victorians followed it anyway, regardless of convenience. Wednesday brides genuinely were more common than Saturday brides in the earlier part of the century, until the Industrial Revolution shifted working patterns and made Saturday the most available day for ordinary people. And then there was the rhyme itself. The complete Victorian wedding rhyme is longer than most people realise. It addressed not just the day but every month of the year, giving each a destiny. June, named after Juno, the Roman goddess of marriage and childbirth, was the luckiest month of all. September was rich and fine. November was bleak but potentially prosperous. And May remained the one month that the rhyme simply condemned outright. Married when the year is new, he will be loving, kind, and true. If you wed when March winds blow joy and sorrow, both you will know. Marry in the month of May, and you will surely rue the day. The poem went on for 12 stanzas, a complete calendar of matrimonial fortune and misfortune memorized by generations of mothers and grandmothers and passed on to nervous brides as a guide. Not as poetry, as instruction. Once the date was settled, the preparations began, and there was a superstition for every stage of them. The dress could not be tried on in its complete form before the wedding day. A bride who put on the full outfit, veil, shoes, everything all at once before the ceremony was tempting fate in a way that could undermine the marriage before it began. For this reason, many Victorian dressmakers left a final stitch of the wedding gown deliberately undone until the morning of the wedding itself. The dress was not finished until the bride was about to be married in it. The making and the using were kept together inseparable, so that no gap could open between the anticipation and the reality. The colour was equally important. White, which we now consider synonymous with weddings, became the dominant choice for bridal gowns, only after Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in February of 1840, wearing a white dress of white Honiton lace over a white satin slip. Before that royal precedent, brides simply wore their finest available dress, whatever colour it happened to be. But once Victoria set the example, white became the standard, and with it came an entire new layer of symbolism about purity, innocence, and the spiritual cleanness of the bride entering her new life. Other colours, however, carried warnings. There was another rhyme. The Victorians were extraordinarily fond of these memory aids. Married in white, you've chosen right. Married in green, ashamed to be seen. Married in grey, you will go far away. Married in red, you will wish yourself dead. Married in blue, your love will be true. Blue specifically was the colour of fidelity. It was considered the colour most pleasing to the spiritual world and most protective against jealousy and faithlessness. This is where the something blue in the Victorian bridal tradition comes from, not as mere decoration, but as a deliberate invocation of the qualities a marriage needed to survive. Which brings us to what might be the single most enduring piece of Victorian wedding superstition that has ever existed. You know it. I am certain of it. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, and a silver sixpence in her shoe. Most people today know the first 4 items and have either forgotten or never heard of the 5th. But in its original Victorian form, the rhyme had all 5, and every element served a precise spiritual purpose. Something old connected the bride to her family's past. More specifically, in early versions of the tradition, the old item was ideally a garter taken from a woman who had already enjoyed a long, happy marriage, so that the good fortune embedded in that garter could transfer itself to the new bride. The happiness was not metaphorical. It was believed to be literally present in the object, like warmth in a stone that has been sitting in the sun. Something new represented the forward-facing hope of the marriage, the new life, the new household, a declaration to the future that this day was a beginning. Something borrowed carried another woman's luck, again, ideally borrowed from a happily married friend or family member, someone whose marriage was a proven success. The borrowing was not practical, it was magical. You were borrowing not the object but the fortune attached to it. Something blue was fidelity, constancy, the colour that the spiritual world recognized as trustworthy, and the silver sixpence in the shoe was prosperity. The literal introduction of money into the marriage placed against the bride's foot carried with her through the ceremony, ensuring that financial good fortune would walk alongside the couple into their new life. 5 elements, 5 separate protections, 5 different spiritual dimensions of what a marriage needed to thrive. Today most people do 3 or 4 of them, have no idea what any of them mean, and feel vaguely that it would be unlucky to skip them entirely. That feeling is Victorian. Now let me ask you something personal, if that is all right. Were any of these at your wedding or at a wedding you have attended? Because I would genuinely wager that they were. Whether the bride knew why or not, whether anyone at the reception could have explained the origin of any of it. The tradition travels forward through time, not on understanding, but on feeling, on the sense that this is simply what you do, what has always been done, what would somehow feel wrong to leave out. 2,000 years of Roman goddess worship and medieval church guidance and Victorian floral symbolism compressed into the action of a bride tucking a borrowed brooch into her bouquet on a Saturday morning. The Victorian courtship period, the time before engagement when a young woman was deciding whether to accept a man's attention, was also governed by an elaborate system of belief that most modern people would find both delightful and slightly alarming. There were formal methods of divination about love that were taken entirely seriously. On Midsummer's Eve, young women would walk backward into a garden at midnight, sprinkle hemp seed over their left shoulders, and recite a specific verse, and whatever appeared in the darkness behind them was supposed to reveal the image of their future husband. This was not considered a party game. It was considered information. If a young woman dreamed of a white horse, she would marry a wealthy man. If she dreamed of a gate left standing open, she would not marry at all. If she found a single long hair from a stranger while brushing her own hair, she would hold it up to candlelight, and the direction it curled would indicate the initials of her future husband. A more widespread practice involved a simple piece of wedding cake. After a wedding, each unmarried guest would receive a small slice wrapped in paper tied with ribbon. The proper thing to do, according to a custom that was apparently followed widely enough to be documented across multiple counties, was to take the cake home, slide it 3 times under your pillow and sleep on it. The dream that came would tell you who you would marry. I find this particular custom endlessly charming, though I do wonder about the state of the pillow by morning. There was also the matter of the bouquet, and its original purpose has almost nothing to do with what we think of today. The medieval practice that eventually became the Victorian bouquet toss began with something considerably less elegant. Wedding guests in the medieval period believed that contact with any piece of the bride's clothing on her wedding day would transfer some of her good fortune to them, and so they grabbed, enthusiastically. Crowds of wedding guests would follow the newlywed couple, trying to pull at the bride's dress to seize a piece of ribbon, to get their hands on anything that had been close to her body on this luckiest of days. Dresses were sometimes torn, celebrations turned chaotic. The solution, which developed gradually through the early modern period and became standard in Victorian times, was the bouquet. The bride carried flowers specifically so that she could throw them to the crowd as a distraction, a gift of symbolic fortune that could be caught and competed for without anyone having to grab at her actual clothing. The lucky catcher, it was said, would be the next to marry. The tradition survives perfectly intact today. The meaning is entirely gone. The laughter at a modern bouquet toss has no idea it is reenacting a crowd of medieval guests trying to tear a bride's dress apart for luck. But there it is, still happening. At venues across the country every single Saturday, the unluckiest day of the week to get married on. One last detail before we move on, and it is one that I have been thinking about since I first discovered it. Queen Victoria changed the Western world's relationship with weddings in at least 2 profound ways. The first was the white dress, as we've already discussed. The second was the veil. Bridal veils stretch back into Roman and ancient Greek tradition, where they were worn specifically to confuse and disorient evil spirits on the journey to the altar. The logic was this: spirits and demons who wanted to curse a bride would be disoriented by the covering, unsure whether the veiled figure was truly the bride they were looking for, unable to target her precisely. The veil was camouflage against the supernatural, a way of making yourself invisible to anything that wished you harm on the most vulnerable day of your life. Victoria's wedding veil in 1840 was noted for its length and beauty. It became an object of fascination and emulation across the English-speaking world. Within a generation, the white veil had become as fixed and essential to the idea of a bride as the ring itself. And so 2,000 years of Roman apotropaic magic of women covering their faces to confuse the spirits of the air travelled forward through time and landed in the pages of Victorian wedding catalogues, advertised alongside orange blossoms and silk gloves, with no mention of its original purpose. Because by 1870 nobody needed the reason anymore. The veil was simply what a bride wore. It was beautiful. It was traditional. And somewhere encoded in the depth of the tradition was the ancient, very human desire to be invisible to whatever might be watching on the day when you were most at risk. Love, it turns out, made the Victorians more superstitious than almost anything else. More than death even, because death was certain. But love was uncertain in ways that made every available form of reassurance feel worth reaching for. And what they reached for tells you something tender and true about what they were afraid of. Not dying alone. Not dying too young, though they were afraid of that too. But choosing wrong. Beginning wrong. Walking into the rest of their lives under the wrong stars in the wrong month without the right things in their pockets and on their fingers and carried in their flowers. They wanted to get it right. And that in every century, in every culture, under every superstition that has ever grown up around love, is the thing that has always been most human about us. Now, if the Victorians surrounded love with this much ritual and protection, you might be wondering what did they do about the days in between the extraordinary moments, not weddings, not deaths, just ordinary life, ordinary time. Because it turns out that the everyday natural world, the birds outside the window, the animals on the road, the behaviour of bees and cats, and the direction of the wind was for the Victorians as full of meaning as any ceremony. A complete language of signs that governed everything from what kind of day you were about to have to whether someone far away had just died. And the birds in particular had a great deal to say. Come with me. Here is a question I want you to hold in your mind tonight. What would it take for you to believe in something that every rational instinct tells you cannot be real? Not a casual wondering. Not a lazy, I guess anything is possible. I mean, genuinely seriously believe the way you believe in gravity or electricity, or the fact that the Earth is round, something that sits entirely outside the boundaries of what science says is possible. For most of us, the honest answer is a great deal. Extraordinary evidence, repeated experiments, peer review, years of accumulated proof. And that precisely is what makes the following story so extraordinary. Because the men I am about to tell you about were not credulous. They were not uneducated. They were not the kind of people who simply wanted to believe and let wanting be enough. They were among the finest scientific minds of the 19th century. They had laboratories. They had instruments. They applied rigorous methodology. They published their findings in serious scientific journals and stood behind them publicly at the cost of their own reputations. And what they concluded after years of careful investigation was that something was happening in those darkened séance rooms that science as they understood it could not explain away. The story begins with a man named William Crookes. If you have studied any physics or chemistry, you may know his name in a different context entirely. William Crookes was the English scientist who discovered the element thallium in 1861, announced through the novel technique of spectroscopy. He invented the Crookes tube, a vacuum tube that would later become the direct predecessor of the cathode ray tube, the fundamental technology behind every television set, manufactured for most of the 20th century. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. He would eventually be knighted for his contributions to science. He was in short exactly the kind of person whose scientific conclusions carried weight. and in 1867 something happened that changed the direction of his life entirely. His younger brother Philip died, 21 years old. He'd been working on an expedition to lay a telegraph cable from Cuba to Florida when he contracted yellow fever. He was dead within weeks. William Crookes was devoted to Philip. The loss broke something in him in a way that all his scientific training could not repair. And in the year that followed, grieving and searching, a colleague persuaded him to attend a séance. Something happened in that room, something Crookes could not explain to his own satisfaction, and he decided that the proper response of a scientist to an unexplained phenomenon was not to dismiss it, but to investigate it. Between 1870 and 1874, Crookes conducted what he intended as a rigorous scientific investigation of spiritualist phenomena. He built a dedicated room in his own home for the experiments so that conditions could be controlled. He imposed strict requirements on the mediums he tested. The sessions had to take place at his home, with his chosen witnesses using whatever apparatus he wished to employ. He tested 3 mediums in particular. Kate Fox, one of the original Fox sisters whose story we have already followed through its full arc from prank to global movement. A Scottish-American medium named Daniel Douglas Home, and a teenage girl from London named Florence Cook. Daniel Douglas Home was by almost every account the most remarkable physical medium of the Victorian era. He was said to levitate, not hover slightly. Levitate, rise from the ground, float horizontally, pass through windows, be seen in the air of a room by multiple witnesses simultaneously. He performed in private salons and in grand homes across Europe. He gave a séance for Napoleon III in Paris. He performed for Queen Sophia of the Netherlands, who wrote afterward that she had seen a heavy golden bell move across the room without anyone touching it, and felt a hand grip her fingers in the darkness, when no human hand should have been there. Crookes tested Home under controlled conditions and recorded what he observed with complete scientific precision. He wrote that he had watched Home rise from the ground, slowly reach a height of approximately 6 inches, remain there for around 10 seconds, and then slowly descend. He designed instruments to measure unexplained forces, a board balanced on a spring sensitive enough to detect tiny changes in weight, and documented what he believed was a measurable force emanating from Home's hands without physical contact. His 1874 report concluded that the phenomena produced by Home, Kate Fox and Florence Cook were genuine. The scientific establishment was not impressed. His colleagues largely refused to believe him. Some suggested he had been deceived. Some questioned his experimental controls. One noted that Crookes had poor eyesight and did not wear glasses at the time of the experiments, raising the uncomfortable possibility that a man of genuine scientific brilliance had simply not been able to see clearly what was happening in front of him. That last detail, I confess, I find almost unbearably poignant. Here is a man who gave years of his life to a question he cared about deeply, who published his conclusions at real professional risk, and the explanation that has outlasted him is that he simply could not see well enough. The Florence Cook investigation is on its own terms one of the strangest episodes in Victorian scientific history. Florence Cook was 15 years old when she first came to Crookes's attention. She was already a working medium performing primarily in darkened rooms, and her specialty was something that the Victorian spiritualist community called materialization, the appearance during a séance of a full physical form that seemed to be a spirit rather than any living person. In Florence Cook's séances, this spirit identified herself as Katie King, described in accounts as the daughter of a 17th century pirate who now served as Florence's spirit guide. Katie King would emerge from the darkness, walk among the sitters, allow herself to be touched, weighed, photographed, and measured. She spoke, she laughed, she held people's hands. On one occasion she held a family's infant, Crookes investigated Florence Cook personally in his own home over an extended period. He took photographs of Katie King. He measured her height and compared it to Florence's. He noted what he described as demonstrable physical differences between the two. He published his findings asserting that Florence Cook was a genuine medium producing genuine paranormal phenomena. The photographs he took still exist. And in them I want to be honest with you here because I think honesty is owed. Katie King looks remarkably like Florence Cook. Not identical, but remarkably similar. The scientific consensus today and among most serious historians of the period is that Florence Cook was an extraordinarily skilled performer who deceived Crookes. The historian Sherry Lynn Lyons put it with a precision that I find memorably sharp here, was a man with a flawless scientific reputation who discovered a new element but could not detect a real live young woman who was masquerading as a ghost. And yet, even knowing all of this, I find something deeply moving in the fact that Crookes never wavered. Long after the investigations ended, long after most of his contemporaries had moved past the whole business, he continued to believe. When Florence Cook died in 1904, Crookes wrote to her family to express his condolences and declared again in writing that his belief in survival after death owed so much of its certainty to her mediumship. He was a man who had lost his brother at 21 years old, who had walked into his séance room in grief, and who had found in those darkened rooms something that looked enough like an answer that he spent the rest of his long life holding on to it. That is not a story about stupidity. That is a story about loss. By 1882, the relationship between science and spiritualism in Victorian England had grown complicated enough that a group of distinguished Cambridge academics decided the situation required a formal institution. They founded the Society for Psychical Research, formally constituted on the 20th of February 1882, with the philosopher Henry Sidgwick Knightbridge, Professor of Moral Philosophy at Cambridge, as its first president. The society was unlike anything that had existed before. Its stated purpose was to approach the investigation of paranormal claims without prejudice of any kind, in the same spirit of rigorous scientific inquiry that had enabled science to solve so many problems in other domains. The membership it attracted was extraordinary. Henry Sidgwick was there. Frederick Myers, a classical scholar who had coined the word telepathy and developed the concept of the subliminal self, a theory of unconscious mental activity that anticipated aspects of both Freudian and Jungian psychology by years. Edmund Gurney, who conducted systematic experiments in thought transference. Oliver Lodge, physicist. William Crookes himself joining on its founding and serving as president in 1897. And eventually William James, the American psychologist widely considered the father of modern psychology, who served as the Society's president in 1894 and 1895. Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate of England. Arthur Balfour, who would go on to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. These were not fringe figures. These were the establishment, the intellectual core of Victorian Britain sitting down to ask what exactly is happening in those rooms. I want to pause here for a moment because I think this deserves emphasis. In 1882, the leading philosopher at Cambridge, the future Prime Minister of England, and the father of modern psychology, all joined an organisation whose stated purpose was to scientifically investigate whether the human mind could communicate with the dead. That tells you something important about the intellectual atmosphere of the Victorian era. It tells you that the question of what happened after death, the question of whether consciousness survived the body, whether the people you had lost were truly gone, was not considered beneath the dignity of serious inquiry. It was considered among the most urgent questions a human being could ask. Do you believe in any form of consciousness after death? I am not asking rhetorically. It is a genuinely interesting question to sit with, and I find myself curious what people actually think. Not what they think they are supposed to think, but what they actually believe in quiet moments. Because the Society for Psychical Research found, when they went looking, that a remarkable number of very rational, very educated people harboured exactly this uncertainty. The question would not stay closed no matter how firmly science pushed it shut. The results of the Society's investigations were, to put it charitably, mixed. They exposed numerous fraudulent mediums. They documented case after case of performers using trapdoors, concealed wires, accomplices, and simple sleight of hand to produce phenomena that appeared supernatural. They published rigorous debunkings of specific claims. In this sense, they did exactly what a scientific investigative body should do. But they also produced some findings they could not easily explain away. The cross-correspondences, a series of automatic writings produced independently by different people in different locations beginning in the early 20th century, appeared when assembled together to form coherent messages that no single author could have composed. The Society's researchers found themselves unable to construct a simple fraud hypothesis that covered all the facts. They published their findings. They remained uncertain. That uncertainty, I think, is the most honest thing about the whole enterprise. The Society for Psychical Research is still operating today. More than a century and 40 years after its founding, it continues to publish a journal, to investigate claims, to sit with questions that most institutions prefer to leave alone. It has never conclusively proven survival of consciousness. It has also never conclusively ruled it out. And I find something quietly admirable in that persistence, in the refusal to either claim victory or admit defeat, in the continued willingness to look. What strikes me most about this whole chapter of Victorian history about Crookes and Home and Florence Cook and the Society and all the brilliant, uncomfortable minds that got tangled up in these questions is how entirely human the situation is, how recognisable. These were people living through the collapse of certainty. Darwin had published in 1859. By the 1870s, the implications were still rippling outward. If humanity was not specially created, if the soul was not something placed in the body by divine intention, then what exactly was it? Where did it come from? Where did it go? Traditional religion still provided answers, but for many educated Victorians, those answers had begun to feel insufficient. They needed something else, something empirical, something that operated by the rules of the world they actually lived in. And what the séance offered or appeared to offer was exactly that. Not faith, evidence, not theology, data. A spirit that could be weighed, photographed, measured. A presence that scientific instruments could supposedly detect. The terrible irony is that the data was almost certainly false, the mediums were almost certainly performing, and yet the desire behind the investigation was completely legitimate, completely understandable. The desire to know whether the people we have loved still exist somewhere. That desire did not make the Victorians foolish, it made them human. And in the question they were asking in the rooms they sat in, the measurements, they took the careful records they kept. They were doing something we still do quietly in our own way. We have not resolved this question. We have largely set it aside. We have decided for the most part not to look. But the question is still there. It has always been there. Now, we leave the laboratory and the séance room and step back outside because while these extraordinary dramas were playing out among scientists and mediums and Cambridge philosophers, the ordinary natural world continued to speak its own language to the families who lived within it every day, a language of birds and animals and weather, of signs in the sky and sounds in the dark, of the 1,000 small communications that the Victorian world believed were being sent constantly from something beyond the visible. Because a crow landing on your roof said something, a robin at your window said something different, and a single sparrow settling on the keys of a parlour piano, said something that would make every person in that room go very quiet. Let us go and listen. Close your eyes for a moment. Well, do not actually close them because then you cannot keep reading. But imagine it with me. You're in a Victorian house on a still summer evening. The windows are open. The curtains barely move. The family's in the parlour talking softly when from somewhere deep in the old wooden beams of the ceiling a sound begins. Tick, tick, tick. Perfectly regular. Like a small clock hidden inside the walls. Like something counting. In that room in that moment, every person present knows what that sound means. Not one of them needs to explain it to the others. Not one of them laughs it off or reaches for a rational explanation. They go quiet. Someone puts down their needlework. Someone else glances toward the room where the elderly grandmother has been resting all week, not quite well enough to join them at dinner. The death watch beetle. Tick, tick, tick. The creature responsible for that sound is not supernatural. It is a small cylindrical, rather unimpressive wood-boring insect approximately 7 millimeters long, a beetle whose larvae burrow into the seasoned hardwood of old buildings, sometimes for up to 10 years before emerging as adults. In spring and early summer, the adult beetles attract mates by doing something that naturalists have described. With a mixture of fascination and sympathy, they bang their heads against the walls of their wooden tunnels. Rhythmically, repeatedly, with a persistence that in the silence of a Victorian night could carry through several rooms. A mating call. That is all it is. A small brown beetle desperate to find a companion repeatedly striking its own head against the wood in the hope that someone will knock back. And yet for centuries from the 17th century through the Victorian age and well beyond that, tapping was one of the most feared sounds in an English household. The naturalist Thomas Brown, writing in the 1650s, noted with some exasperation that few ears had escaped the sound of what he called the death watch, and that the noise has become so freighted with dread that it sent grandmothers and nurses into cold sweats. He tried gently but firmly to explain that it was just a beetle. Nobody particularly wanted to hear it. Because the logic of the superstition was built not on ignorance of the beetle, plenty of people knew perfectly well what was making the sound, but on something more persistent than knowledge. The sound was loudest at night. It was loudest in quiet houses, and in Victorian England where people died at home, and their families gathered in silent vigils beside sick beds, waiting and watching. Death. Watching. The ticking was most audible precisely in the moments when someone was slipping away. The insect and the dying arrived together night after night in the darkest hours, until the association between the two became as certain as gravity. Edgar Allan Poe knew this sound and he used it. Mark Twain knew it, and he put it in a scene in which his young hero Tom Sawyer, lying awake in the darkness, hears the ticking from the wall and shudders, knowing it means someone's days are numbered. The sound crossed the Atlantic, embedded itself in American culture, and kept ticking long after people stopped understanding why it frightened them. The natural world in the Victorian imagination was not a backdrop to human life. It was a conversation, a continuous, layered, richly detailed conversation in which birds and animals and insects and weather patterns all had specific things to say about luck, about death, about the shape of the days to come. The Victorians listened to this conversation with an attention that most of us have entirely lost, and the language they read in it had accumulated over centuries of observation and belief. Let us start with the birds, because birds were the most eloquent communicators in this natural vocabulary. Of all the birds that moved through the Victorian countryside, none carried more cultural weight than the magpie. The magpie is a striking bird, black and white, with a long tail and an iridescent sheen of purple, blue and green in bright light, far more beautiful than its reputation suggests. It is also, as scientists now acknowledge, one of the most intelligent birds in existence. Magpies can recognize themselves in mirrors, can use tools, can remember human faces, can plan ahead in ways that most birds cannot. In China and Korea, the magpie was traditionally a welcome visitor, a bringer of good news, a harbinger of fortunate guests. The Romans admired it for its cleverness. In Victorian England, it was practically the devil, or more precisely, it carried a drop of the devil's blood under its tongue that was the Scottish belief, and it had travelled south with enough conviction to stick. In Somerset country, folk carried onions in their pockets as protection against the influence of magpies, the same way others carried horseshoes or rowan branches. Seeing a lone magpie on your left was particularly dangerous. If you could not avoid the encounter, you had better salute quickly, remove your hat or bow your head or call out a greeting to show respect and neutralize the omen before it had time to settle. And this is how the counting rhyme was born. First recorded in writing in 1780, though almost certainly older than that, the rhyme assigned a destiny to each number of magpies observed together. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told. It existed in dozens of regional variations. In the north, different numbers carried different meanings. In Scotland, the counting went toward darker outcomes. In Devon, the rhyme continued past 7 into territory involving heaven and hell, and the devil himself sitting at 12. The variations do not matter as much as the principle they share, that the magpie in its numbers was broadcasting information, was telling you something about your immediate future, was a messenger from whatever system governed fortune and misfortune, and you had better pay attention. Now here is the thing about this that genuinely gets under my skin. The salute, the instinctive gesture of respect toward a single magpie, the quick touch of the cap or the murmured "Good morning, Captain," is still being performed today, not as a conscious act of belief for the most part, as a reflex, as something that the body knows to do even when the mind has long since stopped understanding why. You will find people across Britain who will tell you with complete self-awareness and mild embarrassment that they simply cannot help saluting a lone magpie. They know it is not rational, they do it anyway. 250 years of repetition have written it into the muscles. Now, tell me something. Honestly, do you do anything like this? Any version of it, any small automatic gesture, when you see a certain bird or hear a certain sound, or notice something in nature that makes you feel, without quite being able to say why, that this is a sign of something. Because I think more people have these moments than are willing to admit them, and the Victorians would have found that complete honesty entirely unremarkable. The robin occupied a completely different position in the Victorian natural vocabulary. Where the magpie was feared and needed, managing the robin was protected, and in a gentle way beloved. The belief was widespread that robins carried the souls of the dead, that when a robin appeared close to you, particularly after a bereavement, it was the spirit of someone you had lost checking in, making sure you were all right, letting you know they were still present in some form. This belief was not treated as frightening. It was treated as a comfort. The robin, with its willingness to come close to human beings, its apparent fearlessness around grief, was read as a sign of presence rather than absence. There are accounts from the Victorian period of recently bereaved families who noticed a robin appearing in their garden daily during the months after a death, and who found in this something they could hold on to. Not proof of anything scientific, not evidence by any standard of rigorous inquiry, just a robin returning, a small warm-chested bird sitting on the garden wall seemingly watching. And killing a robin was one of the most seriously considered bad luck acts in English folk tradition. Not just bad luck for the individual who did it, specific targeted consequences were believed to follow. If a farmer killed a robin, his cow's milk would turn bloody. His buildings would catch fire. If you broke a robin's egg, something precious to you would soon shatter. The robin was protected by a moral weight that no other common garden bird carried. I think about the long human history that produced this belief. The robins that visited the sick rooms, the deathbeds, the grieving windows of households across centuries. The same small bird arriving so reliably at moments of human pain that eventually the connection became woven into how people understood the structure of reality. Beyond the birds, the Victorian natural world communicated in other registers. Bees, for example, were deeply intertwined with the life of a Victorian household in ways that went far beyond honey and garden pollination. There was a practice widespread across the British countryside documented by Victorian folklorists with genuine care called telling the bees. When someone in a household died, someone else had to go to the beehives and tell the bees. This was not optional. This was not a charming custom that people half remembered. This was serious. The bees needed to be informed of the death, ideally in a quiet voice with respect, as though informing a neighbour. In some traditions, the hives were draped in black mourning cloth, alongside the house windows and door knockers. The bees needed to be included in the ceremony of grief, and if you failed to tell them, they would leave. Not metaphorically. Literally, leave, swarm away and find another home. Or they would die in their hives, or their honey would go bad that season. The belief was consistent across regions. The bees had a relationship with a family that required maintenance. They could not be left uninformed about events of this magnitude. They were in some sense part of the household. The poet John Greenleaf Whittier wrote about this tradition beautifully in the 1860s. In a poem that treats it with the seriousness it deserves, not as superstition to be debunked, but as a practice that revealed something true about the human need to involve the natural world in our grief, as if telling the bees made the death more real, more accepted, more placed within a universe that was listening. Rain in the Victorian reading of nature spoke constantly. Large, heavy drops of rain falling suddenly were a sign that someone nearby had recently died. If rain fell into an open grave during a burial, the soul had been accepted and was at peace. Sunshine after a funeral meant the deceased was happy. Thunder following a burial was the sound of a soul arriving in heaven. Weather was not random. Weather was responsive. The sky participated in the ceremonies of human life, acknowledged them, commented on them. The Victorian family standing at a graveside in English drizzle was not standing in indifferent weather. They were standing in weather that had something to say about this particular death, this particular person, this particular moment. I find this a genuinely beautiful way to experience the world, even as I know it is not empirically true. To walk through weather that is responding to you. To feel that the universe registers the events of your life even in small atmospheric gestures. There is one more creature in the Victorian natural language that I want to talk about because its story is to me the most quietly extraordinary of all of them. The sparrow. The sparrow, small, ordinary, brown, abundant, was believed to carry the souls of the dead to heaven. Not the eagle, not the swan, not the raven with its ancient mythology. The sparrow, the most commonplace bird in England. And it was precisely because sparrows were so common that this belief had such power. A sparrow could appear anywhere, on your windowsill in the morning, in your garden after a long illness, on the fence post at the moment you stepped outside after hearing bad news. The soul of a loved one in the Victorian imagination could travel in that small body across any distance and arrive where it was needed unnoticed by everyone except the person it had come to find. There is something about choosing the sparrow, overlooked, unremarkable everywhere and nowhere, that I find extraordinarily moving. The Victorian language of nature selected the most democratic bird possible as its soul carrier. No grand symbolic choice, No eagle for the important deaths, just a sparrow, plain and present and there when you needed it. And when a sparrow entered the house, flew through an open window, settled on a piece of furniture, the reading was different from the gentle outdoor comfort. A sparrow inside the house was alarming. It had come too close. It had crossed the threshold. In that context, it was not a visiting soul, but a death omen, a warning that the boundary between the living and the dead had become dangerously thin. The very same bird read entirely differently depending on which side of the window it occupied. All of these beliefs, the ticking beetle, the counted magpies, the tolled bees, the responsive rain, the travelling sparrows add up to something that I think deserves to be named clearly. The Victorians lived inside a world that was alive in a way that we have largely agreed to set aside. Not alive in a superstitious sense necessarily. Alive in the sense that everything was in conversation with everything else. The natural world was not separate from human experience but continuous with it. The death in the house was connected to the ticking in the wall, to the magpie on the fence, to the bees in the garden, to the rain on the grave. These were not coincidences. They were communications. A universe paying attention to the lives lived within it. We have traded that for something better in many ways. We have antibiotics and weather forecasting, and a scientific understanding of why beetles tap their heads against wood. These are genuine gains. I'm not suggesting we return to the death watch beetle as medical diagnosis. But I do sometimes wonder what we lost when we stopped listening. When the ticking became just a beetle, the magpie just a corvid, the rain just weather. Whether the universe is still sending signals, and whether we have simply stopped knowing how to read them now. We're going to stay close to the natural world for the next part of our story, but we're going to turn from the everyday signals of birds and rain towards something altogether more elaborate, more theatrical, and honestly more disturbing. Because Victorian mourning culture, the rituals of death, the clothing of grief, the jewellery made from the bodies of the loved ones who were gone was a world unto itself. A world in which the boundary between the living and the dead was maintained not just through ritual, but through fashion. Through what you wore on your fingers and around your neck and pressed against your skin for years. What the Victorians put in their lockets is going to stay with you. Let us go there next. Somewhere in an antique shop right now there is a brooch. It is oval, probably about the size of a large coin set in gold with a small glass window in the centre. Behind that glass, arranged with extraordinary care, is a coil of dark human hair, braided, woven into a pattern so deliberate and precise that it could easily be mistaken for silk. There may be a name engraved on the back, a date, perhaps 2 words, in memory. People pick up pieces like this all the time in antique shops. They turn them over. They feel the weight of them in their palm. And then they set them back down with a slightly uncertain feeling that they cannot entirely name. That uncertainty is the correct response. What they are holding is someone's love made physical, someone's grief made wearable, someone's refusal to let a person they had lost simply disappear from the material world. The Victorians were very good at this kind of refusal, and what they built around the fact of death, the rituals, the clothing, the jewellery, the photographs, the rules about who could wear what, for how long, and when, was one of the most elaborate, most sincere, and most genuinely moving cultural systems in modern history. Tonight we are going inside it. To understand Victorian mourning culture, you have to begin with a number. 40 years. That was the average lifespan in Victorian England. Not a number that includes only the very poor or the very sick, the average, across the population weighted across all classes and all conditions. Approximately 1 child in 3 did not survive to the age of 5. In some urban neighbourhoods during cholera epidemics, that proportion rose to 1 in 2. Women died in childbirth regularly. Men died of infections that modern medicine treats with a week's course of antibiotics. Death arrived in Victorian households not as an occasional visitor, but as a constant intimate companion, the background presence against which all of ordinary life was conducted. This is the context inside which Victorian mourning culture must be understood. These were not morbid people seeking out death for dramatic effect. They were people who could not avoid it, who encountered it constantly and personally, and who responded by building an entire social architecture to give it meaning and shape. The architecture was extraordinary in its detail. A widow in Victorian England was expected to mourn her husband in formal dress for a minimum of 2 years. Not 2 years of private grief. 2 years of public, visible, externally regulated grief expressed through every article of clothing she put on her body. The rules were codified in household manuals, in etiquette guides, in publications like Cassell's Household Guide, which laid them out with the thoroughness of a legal document. Deep mourning lasted at least a year. During this phase, the widow's entire wardrobe had to be black, specifically black crepe, a flat, dull, non-reflective fabric manufactured almost exclusively by a single company called Courtaulds. Lustrous materials were forbidden. Satin, velvet, fur, all of these had a sheen that conveyed something other than pure grief, and pure grief was required. The widow wore a black silk weeping veil that fell to the waist or below. She could attend church. She could not go into society. She received visitors who came to her, not the other way around. After a year, she moved into half mourning, where grey and lavender were slowly permitted. The veil was shortened. A degree of social activity was allowed to resume. And these rules applied not just to widows, but to the whole extended family. Each relationship assigned its precise mourning duration. Children mourning parents 1 year. Grandparents or siblings 6 months. Aunts and uncles 2 months. Great-aunts and uncles 6 weeks. First cousins 4 weeks. There was an etiquette guide for death the way there was an etiquette guide for a dinner party. Queen Victoria herself set the example for all of this, and she set it in the most extreme form imaginable. When Prince Albert died on the 14th of December 1861, Victoria wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She never stopped mourning him. The servants were instructed to lay out his clothes each morning as though he would still dress. Fresh water was brought to his shaving basin every day. His chair was kept at the dining table. The world was expected to understand without being told that in her heart she had died with him, and that everything that came after was simply the management of the interval. Her example filtered downward through every level of British society. If the Queen could mourn that visibly that long, that completely then mourning was not weakness. It was devotion. It was the highest possible expression of a love for the lost. Now, let me ask you something that I think about quite a bit. We have almost entirely lost public mourning. The formal, visible, externally expressed grief that Victorian culture required has disappeared from most of the modern Western world. We bury our dead on a Wednesday and return to work on Monday. We expect grief to be private managed and relatively brief in its visible expression. Do you think we're better off for this? I genuinely do not know the answer. I think there is something claustrophobic about the Victorian system. The way it enforced grief through fashion made it impossible to escape the external performance of sorrow, even on days when you might have been capable of something like lightness. The black crepe that shed its dye into the wearer's skin, documented as causing eye irritation and respiratory problems, was not just a symbolic burden. But I also wonder sometimes whether the modern alternative, the rapid return to normal, the expectation that grief be contained and resolved without visible structure, leaves people more alone in their loss than they need to be. Whether the absence of ritual creates its own kind of suffering. The Victorians at minimum made grief visible, made it shared, made the whole community understand at a glance that this person was still in the middle of something, still carrying something heavy, and that required a particular kind of care in return. Inside the mourning period, beyond the clothing, the Victorians kept the dead present in another way that most modern people find genuinely startling. They wore them. Hair jewellery. The practice of weaving the hair of a deceased loved one into brooches, lockets, rings, bracelets, and wrist-length bands was one of the most widespread personal practices of Victorian mourning culture. Not a fringe tradition. Not something practiced only by the eccentric or the obsessive. A mainstream commercially supported, publicly accepted form of remembrance that crossed every class boundary. The logic was direct, and I find it worth taking seriously even from a contemporary distance. Hair is the part of a person that continues to grow after death. It is the most physical, most personal, most biological artifact of a human being, something that has actually been part of their body, that retains their specific colour and texture, and even in some cases their particular scent. Unlike a portrait, which is a representation, hair is a presence. It is the actual person in some irreducible material sense. Victorian women and some men wore this presence close to their bodies, often for years. A braided bracelet made from a dead child's hair worn daily for the rest of a mother's life. A brooch containing a lock from a husband's beard pinned to a bodice every morning. A ring with a small panel of woven hair beneath a glass dome slid onto a finger at the beginning of each day and removed only at night. By 1867, the craft had grown so prevalent and so commercially popular, a man named Mark Campbell published a book called Self-Instructor in the Art of Hairwork, a complete manual teaching readers to weave, braid, and design their own mourning jewellery from family members' hair. It went through multiple editions. It was not a morbid curiosity. It was a craft manual as practical and as seriously intended as a sewing guide. Some women sent hair to professional craftsmen who would weave it into elaborate designs, featuring flowers, landscapes, even miniature figurative scenes. But there were documented anxieties about this. Customers wrote worried letters, questioning whether the craftsman had actually used their loved one's hair, or whether they had substituted horsehair or the hair of a stranger for a piece that could no longer serve its purpose. The hair was the point, not the design. The design was just the way you wore the person. And then came photography. The daguerreotype was invented in 1839, and within a decade it had created a completely new relationship between the living and the dead. Before photography, only the very wealthy could afford a painted portrait, the only lasting visual record of how a person looked. For the vast majority of Victorian families, when someone died, that was the end. Whatever image you carried of them in your mind was all you had, and it was subject to the inevitable erosion of memory. Features blur. The particular angle of a smile becomes uncertain. The colour of eyes that you once knew precisely begins to drift. Photography changed this, and it changed it paradoxically most powerfully in relation to death. Because for many Victorian families, the death of a loved one, especially the death of a child, was the first and only occasion they had ever hired a photographer. They had no portrait from life. They had never sat for a picture. And so the photograph taken after death was not a post-mortem oddity. It was simply the portrait, the only one that would ever exist. The Victorian photographers who specialised in this work understood what they were doing. They advertised with the motto, "Secure the shadow ere the substance fades," the shadow being the photograph, the substance being the person's body already beginning the process of returning to the earth. They were extraordinarily skilled at their work. The deceased were posed most often as sleeping arranged with care among pillows, sometimes surrounded by flowers, sometimes held in the arms of a mother sitting just outside the frame. Eyes that were closed might have paint added to their lids during the development process, giving the impression that the child was looking up alive and aware. Cheeks would be given a rose tint to suggest warmth and health. The whole composition was crafted to present the person in a state of suspension, not dead, not quite alive, but held in a moment that could be returned to. The images were placed in family albums. They were sent to relatives by post using the new carte de visite technology that allowed multiple prints from a single negative. They were kept in lockets alongside the hair jewellery, the photograph on one side, and a coil of hair on the other. I find it necessary to sit with what these photographs actually were before I allow myself to find them unsettling. They were not morbid for the sake of morbidity. They were not strange practices designed to disturb future generations. They were acts of love performed under conditions of irreversible loss by people trying to hold on to something that was already gone. There is a photograph I've spent time thinking about this specific type of image of a woman sitting in a chair, her face turned slightly away from the camera, wearing black. In her arms she holds a child who is clearly sleeping, or is clearly not sleeping. The child's face is peaceful, the eyes closed, the position carefully arranged. The mother's hand rests on the child's chest in a gesture so familiar, so ordinary, the hand of a parent resting on a child while the child sleeps, that it becomes almost unbearable to look at once you understand what you are seeing. She is not holding a sleeping child. She's holding the only physical evidence she will ever have that her child existed. I cannot look at that kind of photograph without thinking about what it means to live in a world where you have to do that, where that is the choice you are given, this photograph or nothing at all. The Victorians chose the photograph every time, and I think they were right to. Mourning dress, hair jewellery, post-mortem photographs. All of these taken together built a world in which the dead were not simply removed from the lives of the living, they were kept present. They were worn on the body and carried in the pocket and displayed on the shelf. They were talked about, looked at, remembered in specific detail rather than general sentiment. And this was not superstition in the way we usually mean the word. This was not a fear of what the dead might do if improperly managed. It was something else, something I think deserves a different name. It was refusal. A collective culturally sustained refusal to pretend that loss is clean. That the people who leave us are simply gone and should be politely forgotten. There is a diary entry from 1872 written by a London widow named Eleanor who had lost her husband to tuberculosis. She wrote to forget him would be to kill him again. She kept his chair at the dining table for the rest of her life. She was not mad. She was not unhealthy. She was doing what grief sometimes asks of us, insisting that the life that was lived mattered enough to leave a mark on the life that continues. The Victorians built an entire culture around that insistence. And sitting here in the 21st century watching how quickly and efficiently we've been taught to clear the table and move on, I sometimes think they had something we lost. Not the crepe, not the rigid timetables, not the industry that profited from all of it, but the permission to refuse, to say this person was here and their absence is real, and I am not yet ready to pretend otherwise. We have now spent time inside almost every corner of Victorian superstition, the domestic rituals, the séance rooms, the mirrors and the birds and the language of grief. But there is one movement we have not yet encountered in full, one that rose up in the second half of the Victorian era among its most educated, most ambitious citizens, a movement that tried to channel everything the age had learned about the invisible world into something organised, systematic and frankly rather intimidating. The occult revival, the Golden Dawn, the secret societies that drew writers, artists and intellectuals into formal systems of magic at the very peak of the British Empire, and why that happened, what was actually driving intelligent people towards ceremonial magic in the 1880s and 1890s, is a story that makes everything else we have discussed make complete sense. Stay close. Somewhere in London in the autumn of 1887, a coroner named William Westcott was riding home in a hansom cab when he stopped to browse a second-hand bookstall on Farringdon Road. he found tucked among unremarkable papers a bundle of handwritten pages in a cipher he did not immediately recognize. He was also a senior member of a Rosicrucian Masonic lodge, a man who had spent years studying ancient magical traditions in his spare time. So he took the pages home, sat down with them, and spent weeks decoding what turned out to be 60 pages of encrypted ritual instructions. Or so the story goes. Because here is the first extraordinary thing about the Golden Dawn right from the very beginning. At its founding moment, something about it was not entirely what it appeared to be. William Westcott brought the decoded manuscripts to a friend and collaborator, a sharp-driven, rather theatrical man named Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, who was already deeply immersed in esoteric studies. Together they expanded the cipher manuscripts into a full system of ceremonial rituals. And then Westcott did something that would define the organization's character from that point forward. He invented a supporting fiction. The manuscripts, he claimed, had come with a letter pointing to a woman in Germany, a Countess Anna Sprengel, who was the chief of a secret European magical order dating back centuries. He wrote letters to this woman. Or, as scholars now believe, he wrote letters pretending to be from this woman, which he then showed to others as proof of the order's ancient lineage and legitimacy. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was formally consecrated on the 1st of March 1888 in London. Its founding rested on documents that are now widely understood by historians to have been forged. And yet what was built on those foundations, the curriculum, the rituals, the community, the sheer creative energy that poured into it over the following decade was entirely real. The lie at the centre made something genuine possible. Which is, I have to say, a very Victorian way of doing things. By the mid-1890s, the Golden Dawn had gathered around 300 members organised across 5 temples in London, Edinburgh, Bradford, Paris and Weston-super-Mare. Now 300 does not sound like many, but consider who those 300 people were. William Butler Yeats joined on the 7th of March 1890 at MacGregor Mathers's personal invitation. At the time, Yeats was 24 years old and already establishing himself as a significant poet. He would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1923, widely regarded as the greatest poet writing in English of his generation. He remained involved with the Golden Dawn's successor organizations until at least 1922, more than 30 years. He later wrote directly about what the practice meant to his work. If I had not made magic my constant study, I could not have written a single word of my Blake book, nor would the Countess Kathleen have ever come to exist. Not a casual interest, not a phase he outgrew, a constant study, a foundation. Florence Farr was an acclaimed London actress, a close associate of George Bernard Shaw, and one of the most intellectually formidable women in the London art scene. She became, after one of the founders stepped back, the chief adept of the entire organisation in England, and she held that position with serious authority. Maud Goney, the Irish revolutionary, whose beauty and passion Yeats famously spent decades pursuing and mourning in verse, was also a member. Constance Wilde, the wife of Oscar Wilde, joined. Annie Horniman, the woman who would later found the Abbey Theatre in Dublin and essentially create the modern Irish literary movement, was a significant member and financial supporter. And then there was Arthur Machen, whose horror fiction would eventually influence H.P. Lovecraft. Algernon Blackwood, whose stories of cosmic horror remain genuinely unsettling more than a century later. Evelyn Underhill, whose scholarly work on mysticism is still read seriously in theological circles today. And joining in November of 1898 near the organisation's end, the 23-year-old Aleister Crowley, who would go on to become the most notorious occultist of the 20th century, described variously as a genius, a fraud, a monster, and a genuine innovator depending on who you asked. What was all this about? Let me be specific, because I think the vague answer, the Victorians were interested in the occult, misses what is actually interesting here. The Golden Dawn was a structured educational and initiatory system. It had grades like a university. Members progressed through 10 levels of initiation, each requiring genuine study of specific subjects. The outer order covered astrology, tarot, divination, geomancy, the relationships between the Hebrew Kabbalah and the Western magical tradition, and a system of symbolic correspondences linking colours, numbers, planets, and spiritual forces into a unified framework. The inner order moved into astral projection, scrying, alchemy, and ceremonial ritual. This was not parlour tricks. It was not seances in the dark. It was a systematic attempt to map and engage with what its members believed was an invisible dimension of reality that science had not yet accounted for and possibly never could, but which could be approached through disciplined practice, rigorous study, and genuine personal transformation. The order also notably admitted women as equal members at a time when almost no other fraternal organisation in Britain did. Women could hold the highest positions, perform the most advanced rituals, and were treated in the formal language of initiation as equals in all things. In 1888, Victorian England, this was genuinely radical. But the question I want to sit with, the question I think is actually most interesting, is why? Why did William Butler Yeats, who was not stupid and was not credulous, spend 30 years studying ceremonial magic? Why did Florence Farr, a successful independent woman in a world that offered very little to women of her intelligence and ambition, invest years in this organisation? Why did a generation of some of the sharpest creative minds in Britain choose at the height of the Age of Reason to walk into a room and perform elaborate rituals involving wands and Egyptian god forms and the invocation of forces they called archangels? Here is the answer I keep arriving at, and I want to offer it carefully because I think it deserves care. The Victorian era had broken religion. Not for everyone, not entirely, but for a significant portion of the educated middle class, for people who read Darwin and took him seriously, who understood the implications of what geological science was revealing about the age of the Earth, who could no longer sustain the older certainties traditional Christianity had become at best uncomfortable, and at worst impossible. And yet these same people still needed what religion had always provided. Not just the theological claims, but the other things, the ritual, the community, the sense of participating in something larger than the individual self, the feeling that beauty and meaning were woven into the fabric of existence, the practice of attention to invisible dimensions of experience. The Golden Dawn offered all of those things, stripped of the specific theological claims that had become untenable, and replaced with a system flexible enough to absorb almost any individual metaphysics. You did not have to believe in a Christian God to work within it. You did not have to believe in literal magic. You had to believe, or at least be willing to act as though you believed that there were forces in the world beyond the merely material, and that disciplined attention to those forces could change you. For Yeats, that belief was total and sincere. For others, it may have been something closer to an artistic practice, a sustained engagement with symbolic thinking that produced real effects on the imagination, whatever its ultimate metaphysical status. Either way, it worked. The poetry Yeats wrote after decades of magical practice is among the most complex, symbol-laden and genuinely mysterious verse in the English language. The theatrical work that came out of the Golden Dawn community contributed directly to one of the most important literary revivals in 20th century history. Something happened in those rooms. Now, Aleister Crowley is the name most people know from this period, and I want to say something about him that goes against the usual narrative. Crowley was expelled from the Golden Dawn in 1900, largely because the senior members, Yeats prominent among them, found his behaviour, his morality, and his personality intolerable. He was 24 years old and already insufferable, in the specific way that very intelligent young men who have just discovered that they are capable of more than others can sometimes be. He wanted to advance faster than the system permitted. He wanted power he had not earned. He tried to take over the London Lodge by force and was physically blocked by the other members. After his expulsion, he went on to found his own order, develop his own system, write extensively about everything he had learned and invented, and become eventually a figure so famous for being shocking that his actual ideas got somewhat lost in the mythology. The real story of Crowley is complicated. He was a mountaineer of genuine ability, a writer of considerable range, a scholar of real depth, and also a person who caused measurable harm to real people who trusted him. These things can all be true simultaneously. He is not the person I find most interesting in this story. The person I find most interesting is Yeats. Think about what it means that William Butler Yeats, the man who would write The Second Coming, who would describe a widening gyre and a rough beast slouching toward Bethlehem, spent 30 years doing ceremonial magic. The Second Coming was written in 1919. The Golden Dawn had been functioning for 11 years when Yeats joined. The imagery in that poem, The Falcon and the Falconer, the ceremony of innocence drowned, the rough beast is saturated with the symbolic vocabulary of hermetic magic. It is not a metaphor. It is the actual framework through which Yeats understood history and time, and it produced one of the most important poems of the 20th century. What do we do with that? I genuinely do not know. I think you have to hold it. The Golden Dawn was built on forged manuscripts. Its founder may have fabricated the letters that gave it legitimacy. Several of its most prominent members were in retrospect performing elaborate self-deception. And it produced as a byproduct some of the most significant art of the modern era. There is a moment in this story that I return to often. In 1896 or 1897, William Westcott the coroner, who had started everything, who had decoded the manuscripts and built the order's foundational mythology, lost a case full of occult papers in a hansom cab. The papers were found. His connection to the Golden Dawn was brought to the attention of his employers. A London coroner, an official of the Crown whose job involved determining the causes of death, was discovered to be running a secret magical society. He was told to choose the society or the position. He chose the position. He quietly stepped back from the Golden Dawn, told no one why, and returned to his regular life as a government official who examined bodies and signed death certificates. I find this detail almost unbearably ordinary and human. The man who built a network for accessing the invisible world, who manufactured letters from a fictional German countess to give his magical system ancient authority, who set in motion a chain of events that influenced the direction of English literature, he gave it all up because he did not want to lose his job. He was not a mystic who transcended the material world. He was a Victorian man who needed his salary. The Golden Dawn, fractured in its 12th year, torn apart by exactly the kind of human drama ego-betrayal power struggles, accusations of forgery. Crowley's attempted coup that apparently no amount of magical training can protect against. The various lodges either dissolved or mutated into successor organizations, each claiming the true inheritance of the original teachings. But its influence did not end. The Rider-Waite tarot deck, the one that looks familiar, the one that appears on playing cards and phone cases and notebook covers, and is the basis of virtually every popular tarot image produced since 1910, was designed by Pamela Colman Smith, a Golden Dawn member under the direction of Arthur Edward Waite, also a Golden Dawn member, published in 1909. The deck that most people think of when they think of tarot is a product of this organization. Modern Wicca, the largest new religious movement of the 20th century, traces its ritual structure and much of its theological framework directly to Golden Dawn, materials filtered through later practitioners, and the Hermetic Kabbalistic framework that the Golden Dawn assembled and systematized the correspondence tables. The symbolic associations, the system for understanding the structure of spiritual reality, is still the dominant framework for Western esoteric practice today, more than a century and a quarter after the original order collapsed. Not 300 people in 5 Victorian lodges, a cultural inheritance that reached millions. Here is what I take away from the Golden Dawn. The Victorian era tried with everything it had to replace the old certainties with new ones. Science for faith, evidence for revelation, progress for providence, and in many ways it succeeded magnificently. But something in the human being resists a world that is only material, only measurable, only what the instruments can detect. The poets and artists and intellectuals who walked into Golden Dawn lodges and learned to trace the symbols of the Kabbalah and invoke the names of archangels, they were not retreating from modernity. They were trying to hold together the things modernity was pulling apart. To stay in contact with beauty, with mystery, with the sense that the universe contains more than physics can account for. Whether they were right about the invisible world, I honestly cannot say. But I believe they were right about the need. And now we've reached the last chapter of this long journey through the Victorian imagination. We have been in the parlours and the séance rooms, the darkened mirrors, and the hidden walls, the mourning lockets and the occult lodges. But there is one final story to tell, the one that brings it all home. Because everything the Victorians believed, feared and cherished, every superstition we have traced through this entire night, did not disappear when their era ended. It travelled. It transformed. It slipped into the next century and the next, and quietly settled into the habits and reflexes of the modern world, including yours. The superstitions that are still living in your life right now, the ones you inherited without realizing it, are waiting in the final part of our story. We are almost there. Let me ask you something direct. The last time you spilled salt, did you throw a pinch over your left shoulder? The last time something good happened and you said it out loud, did you find yourself reaching for something wooden? The last time you were at a hotel, did you notice whether the elevator had a button for the 13th floor? And the last time someone sneezed near you, did you say "bless you" before you even made a conscious decision to? These are not Victorian questions. These are Tuesday afternoon questions. These are as ordinary as anything in your daily life. But here is what I want you to consider tonight. Every single one of those reflexes, every automatic reach for wood, every pinch of salt thrown to the left, every absent "bless you," has a direct ancestor. A specific moment in history where it began. A culture that built it and passed it forward generation by generation until it arrived still living in your hands right now. And a significant number of those ancestors are Victorian. Let us start with the numbers because they are genuinely surprising. A YouGov poll conducted in 2022 asked more than 1,000 American adults about their beliefs and practices around 30 common superstitions. The results reveal something that I find both reassuring and quietly fascinating. 28% of Americans say they believe in making a wish when blowing out birthday candles. Another 28% believe that seeing a shooting star is a good omen. 27% say "bless you" after a sneeze, not as a social nicety they perform without feeling, but because they genuinely consider it meaningful in some way. 21% believe that breaking a mirror brings bad luck. 21% believe that walking under a ladder is genuinely risky. And 1 in 4 Americans, 25%, carries or wears a lucky charm at least occasionally. Not metaphorically. Literally carries an object that they believe in some functional sense improves their luck. These are not marginal numbers from the fringes of society. These are a quarter of the American adult population performing superstitious rituals with some degree of sincerity in the middle of the 21st century. And here is the detail I find most interesting of all, the one that challenges every easy narrative about progress and enlightenment. According to the same research, younger people are more likely to report superstitious beliefs than older ones. The 18 to 29 age group is the most likely demographic to describe themselves as superstitious. Not grandmothers in quiet farmhouses, people who have grown up with the internet, with science communication, with access to more information than any generation in history. We did not evolve out of this, we kept it. Now let us trace exactly how some of these things travelled from Victorian England to your kitchen table. Take knock on wood. The phrase appears in American and British speech so automatically that most people who use it have genuinely never stopped to think about where it came from. The earliest documented written reference to the practice dates to around 1805. It appears researchers believe to have grown out of 19th century children's games, specifically a version of tag popular in Victorian England called Tiggy Touchwood, in which players were safe from being caught if they were physically touching something wooden. You were in contact with the wood, you were protected, and the game, as children's games do, leaked out of childhood and into the adult world, where the principle of protection through contact with wood carried the emotional logic forward even after anyone had forgotten the game it came from. Folklore scholar Steve Roud, writing in a book called The Law of the Playground, states directly, given that the game was concerned with protection and was well known to adults as well as children, it is almost certainly the origin of our modern superstitious practice of saying touch wood. He adds, with the mild exasperation of someone who has spent a career correcting romantic folk history, the claim that the latter goes back to when we believed in tree spirits is complete nonsense. 19th century children playing tag in Victorian schoolyards gave us the reflex that 300 million English-speaking adults perform every time they tempt fate out loud. The umbrella superstition is almost entirely Victorian in its origin, and it has a practical layer that most people never know about. When spring-loaded metal-spoked umbrellas were introduced in Victorian England, replacing the older, smaller, simpler parasols with a device that could open with considerable force, they were genuinely dangerous to open indoors. The mechanism could snap with enough power to shatter a vase knock and ornament off a mantelpiece or catch someone in the face. Victorian households full of delicate objects and low ceilings, and people sitting in close proximity were genuinely not the right places to spring open a large metal device. So the practical warning, do not open your umbrella inside, you will break something, needed to be made compelling enough that people would actually follow it. And the way you make a practical warning compelling is you attach a consequence that feels serious. The consequence that attached itself was someone in your household will be harmed. The practical warning became a death omen. The death omen became a habit. The habit outlasted the original spring-loaded Victorian umbrellas by a century and a half long after the immediate physical danger was resolved by better engineering. You still flinch when someone opens an umbrella indoors. You're protecting objects that no longer exist from a device that no longer works that way, because a Victorian household management principle needed teeth. Friday the 13th deserves a longer look because its story is more recent than most people realise. The number 13 on its own has an ancient and multicultural record of being considered unlucky. Norse mythology placed Loki the trickster, the chaos bringer, as the 13th guest at a divine dinner that ended in violence and death. Christian tradition counted 13 at the Last Supper, with the 13th participant being the one who would betray everyone else. The medieval Knights Templar were arrested on Friday the 13th of October, 1307, in a mass roundup ordered by the King of France that effectively destroyed the order. But the specific combination Friday the 13th as a single unified superstitious concept is a Victorian invention. It was not until the latter half of the 19th century that writers and commentators in England began to specifically combine the unlucky associations of Friday and the unlucky associations of 13 into a single designated bad luck day. The Victorian talent for systematizing and codifying beliefs that had previously existed separately gave us this particular fear in its complete form. The American horror franchise that has now placed that date permanently in the cultural imagination premiered in 1980. But it was naming something that had already existed in the Victorian-built architecture of Western superstition for 100 years before Hollywood got hold of it. Bless you. After a sneeze is older than the Victorians, it stretches back through medieval Christianity and into ancient Rome, but the form it takes in modern life, the reflexive social utterance that most people now produce without thinking, was shaped and transmitted largely through the Victorian period. The original logic varied by tradition. Some ancient cultures believed a sneeze expelled the soul briefly from the body, leaving a dangerous gap through which something harmful could enter. Others believed the opposite, that a sneeze was the body expelling something dangerous and that the blessing helped complete the expulsion. In both cases, something needed to be said. A moment of vulnerability needed to be acknowledged and addressed. The Victorian era, which absorbed and transmitted so many older practices, kept this one fully alive. The social expectation that a sneeze requires a verbal response remains intact today, in every English-speaking culture in the world, at every social level, in every kind of room. You can be in a boardroom, you can be in a church, you can be in a quiet library. Someone sneezes and 30% of the room says "bless you" before they have made any decision about it. The ancient world is still blessing you. 1,200 years of Christian practice is still in your mouth. Now I want to spend a moment on something that the statistics about superstition never quite capture. The numbers count people who admit to beliefs and practices. But there is another layer underneath the admission, the people who would deny being superstitious in any survey, who would describe themselves as entirely rational, who would say with complete confidence that they do not believe in any of this. And yet, a behavioral scientist at the University of Chicago named Jane Risen published a paper in 2015 describing what she called acquiescence. Her finding was this: even when people are fully aware that a superstition is irrational, even when they can articulate exactly why it makes no logical sense, many of them continue to act on it anyway. They detect the error in their thinking and choose not to correct it. They know the magpie is just a bird. They salute it anyway. Risen's term for this is eloquent acting on an intuition you know to be wrong. The awareness of the irrationality does not neutralize the feeling. The feeling has its own authority separate from belief. And I think this is the most honest and interesting thing that research on superstition has revealed. It is not that people are irrational, it is that the human nervous system appears to contain a layer of meaning-making that operates independently of the rational mind, and that this layer is very old, very deeply embedded, and very persistent in the face of contradictory evidence. The Victorians built an enormous, elaborate, richly detailed system for engaging with that layer. We still live inside parts of that system without necessarily knowing we do. There is something else I want to say here, and I want to say it directly because I think it matters. We have spent this entire story treating Victorian superstition with, I hope, genuine respect and curiosity, not as delusion to be corrected, not as ignorance to be contrasted with modern wisdom, but as a serious, sustained, deeply human attempt to make sense of a world that was genuinely uncertain and genuinely frightening. And I want to make this observation plainly. The uncertainty has not gone away. We have more knowledge than the Victorians did. We have antibiotics and weather forecasting, and a much more accurate understanding of how stars form and how cells divide, and how the brain processes grief. These are real gains, and they are not trivial, but the fundamental conditions that generated Victorian superstition, the uncertainty about what will happen next, the grief for people we have lost the desire to feel, that our choices have some bearing on our fate, the need to find meaning in a universe that does not automatically provide it. None of those conditions have been resolved. They have simply been addressed by different tools in different centuries. The Victorian who stopped every clock in the house after a death was doing something that served the same purpose as whatever you do now when grief makes the world feel unmanageable and you reach for something that gives you a sense of participation, of not being entirely passive in the face of loss. And the Victorian who threw salt over her shoulder before leaving the house in the morning, she was doing something that serves the same purpose as whatever small ritual you perform before something important. Whatever you check, whatever you wear, whatever you tell yourself, to get through the moments when you feel most exposed to the randomness of existence. We are still them. We are their descendants. Every single superstition we still perform is a message from the past moving forward through time in the bodies and habits of people who no longer know who sent it. And here is what I find most astonishing about all of this as I reach the end of this long journey through the Victorian imagination. We began tonight in 1879 in a gaslit city at the height of empire, surrounded by the sounds of science and progress and a civilization that believed it was winning against the dark. And everywhere we looked there were candles in the windows, hidden shoes in the walls, salt thrown over left shoulders, bees being told about deaths, clocks stopped at the moment someone stopped breathing, hair woven into gold brooches and pressed against skin that was still warm. These people were us, not as a metaphor, literally, genetically, culturally. The beliefs that shaped how they moved through their world are still right now tonight in the habits you will perform without thinking when you wake up in the morning moving through yours. We are almost at the end of this story, but not quite yet. Because there is one final question waiting, the one that has been underneath all of this from the very beginning, the question that every séance and every mirror and every salted threshold was really asking. What does it mean that human beings across every century, every culture, every level of scientific advancement have never been able to entirely stop believing in the invisible? What does that persistence tell us about what we are that is where we are going next? And I think the answer might be the most important thing we've discussed tonight. Come with me. Here is the question I have been sitting with since we first began this journey. Not the easy question. Not, why did the Victorians believe in so many strange things? We have answered that one together over many hours from many different angles. The harder question, the one underneath all of this, why does it never stop? Why across every civilization we have ever studied, across every level of scientific and technological development, across every culture that has ever existed, anywhere on Earth, why does the human being never fully finally stop making meaning out of things that have no demonstrable meaning? A sparrow landing on a piano, a single magpie on the left, salt spilled at the wrong moment, a mirror that fell on its own, a ticking in the wall at the wrong time of night. These things keep meaning something to us. They have always meant something to us. And no amount of education, no amount of accumulated knowledge, no amount of scientific progress has ever in the entire history of humanity made them stop. So what is actually going on? The scientific answer, when you dig into it seriously, is both more interesting and more humbling than most people expect. The human brain is at its most fundamental level a pattern detection machine. This is not a metaphor. It is a structural description. The entire architecture of the nervous system, the way neurons connect and reinforce each other, the way memories form, the way attention allocates itself, is organized around the task of finding patterns in the environment and extracting predictions from them. This capacity is the reason we are here. Our ancestors, who are best at detecting patterns, who noticed that certain cloud formations preceded storms, that certain animal tracks meant predators were near, that certain berries caused illness, while others provided energy those ancestors lived to pass on their genes. The ones who could not detect patterns, or who ignored the patterns they detected, did not fare as well. We are the descendants of the best pattern finders our species ever produced. And that is beautiful and useful, and also in one specific way a source of endless difficulty, because a system that is calibrated to find patterns does not always know when to stop. The same neural architecture that kept our ancestors alive on the savannah will, given the chance, find a pattern in anything. In the arrangement of tea leaves at the bottom of a cup, in the number of crows on a fence, in the position of the planets at the moment of someone's birth, in whether a bird settled on the left side of the path or the right. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It just cannot always distinguish between patterns that are real and patterns that are constructed. There is a researcher named Michael Shermer who has studied this phenomenon for decades and given it a name that I find genuinely useful. He calls it patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in meaningless noise. And here is what Shermer says about who does it. Everyone. Not uneducated people. Not frightened people. Not people from cultures that have not benefited from scientific advancement. Everyone everywhere all the time to varying degrees. His research found that this tendency increases in conditions of stress, uncertainty, and high stakes, precisely the conditions that defined the Victorian world, and precisely the conditions that continue to define the moments when most of us reach for a superstition. The night before something important, the day something goes badly wrong, the week after a loss. When the stakes are high and the outcome is uncertain, that is when the pattern-finding machine works hardest and finds the most. But I want to push past the neuroscience for a moment because I think the scientific explanation, while accurate, misses something important about what superstition actually is. Here is what I mean. A Victorian woman standing in her kitchen in 1875 who reaches for the salt shaker after spilling it and carefully throws a pinch over her left shoulder, she is not having a brain malfunction. She is not experiencing a cognitive error. She is participating in something. She's participating in a living tradition that connects her through gesture to every person who has performed that same gesture before her. To her mother, who taught her. To her grandmother, who taught her mother. Back through generations of women standing in kitchens and fields and farmhouses throwing salt over their shoulders at the exact same angle for the exact same reason. When she does that, she is not alone. She's part of something continuous, something that stretches behind her through time and gives her for one small moment the feeling that the universe is organized, that cause and effect are real, that her actions have meaning. And that feeling, however you want to analyze its neurological underpinnings, is not nothing. That feeling is one of the things that makes human life bearable. Think about the word ritual for a moment. We tend to use it in a vaguely dismissive way, as a shorthand for something people do out of habit, without thinking something with the form but not the substance of meaning. Oh, it's just a ritual. He has all these rituals. But the actual function of ritual, what ritual does in human life across every culture and every century, is something that psychology has studied with increasing seriousness over the past several decades. The findings are consistent. Rituals reduce anxiety. They improve performance under pressure. They help people regulate emotion in moments of grief and loss. They create social cohesion, a shared performance of meaning that makes people feel less alone. A 2010 study found that golfers who were told they were using a lucky ball showed significantly less anxiety, more confidence, and measurably better performance than those told nothing about the ball. The lucky ball was not special, but the belief that it was special changed the neurological state of the person holding it and the changed neurological state produced changed outcomes. The placebo is real. The effect is real, even when the mechanism is not. When you knock on wood, your nervous system does something. It does not do what your great-great-grandmother thought it did. It does not invoke the protection of tree spirits or prevent fate from hearing your boast. But it does something. It performs a small ceremony of acknowledgement. It says, I know that good things can be disrupted. I know that luck is not guaranteed. I am not taking anything for granted. And that acknowledgement, that tiny embodied act of humility, before the uncertainty of existence changes the quality of attention you bring to the next few minutes, that is not nothing. That has never been nothing. Now I want to bring it back to the Victorians one final time, because I think the Victorians understood something that we often pretend we have moved beyond. They understood that human beings need ceremony, not just as a social nicety, not just as a form of entertainment or distraction, as a genuine psychological and spiritual necessity, as a way of marking the moments that matter: birth, love, death, loss, the turning of seasons, the closing and opening of years, with something that rises above the merely practical, something that says this moment is different from ordinary time. This matters. We are paying attention. The elaborate mourning dress. The clock stopped at the moment of death. The sparrow told that someone is gone. The séance held in the half-dark hands on the table, in the hope that what was loved might still speak. All of it, even the parts that look most strange to modern eyes, was ceremony. Was the refusal to let significant things pass unmarked. Was the insistence that the invisible dimensions of life, love, grief, hope, the sense of connection across the boundary of death were real enough to deserve their own language of gesture and ritual and symbol, and the loss of that, the gradual, dignified, scientifically justified loss of public ceremony that has characterized the last 150 years of Western culture, has left something that I think we have not entirely figured out how to replace. We still need ceremony. We still perform it in the private rituals that remain: the birthday wishes blown across candle flames, the salt thrown over the shoulder, the wood knocked on before something important, but we have largely stripped it of its communal acknowledged public dimension. We have made it private and slightly embarrassing, something to do quietly or apologize for. The Victorians were not embarrassed about their need for ceremony, and perhaps that is the most Victorian thing of all. Not the specific beliefs which were often wrong, not the specific rituals which were often elaborate, but the willingness to take the invisible dimensions of experience seriously, to build them into the structure of a life, to say out loud and in public the things we cannot measure are still real. So here we are. We have travelled together through 12 parts of a long, strange, beautiful story. We started in a gaslit parlour in 1879 with a civilization standing at the edge of modernity and still afraid of the dark. We passed through hidden shoes and witch bottles, through séance rooms and broken mirrors, through the extraordinary sadness of 2 young girls cracking their toe joints and changing the spiritual lives of millions. We stood at the bedsides of the dying with the death watch beetle counting from the walls. We walked through mourning dress and hair jewellery and the lockets of a queen who never stopped missing someone. We sat in the secret lodges of the Golden Dawn where the finest poets of the age were learning to trace symbols that were older than England. We followed every superstition that survived the Victorian era and arrived quietly in the habits of your everyday life. And now we are here, at the end of the journey, and I want to tell you what I actually believe after spending all this time with these people. I believe the Victorians were wrong about many things. The specific mechanisms they attributed to their superstitions were almost certainly incorrect. The dead do not get trapped in mirrors. Knocking on wood does not summon protective tree spirits. The death watch beetle was not sent by death, it was just trying to find a mate. But I believe they were right about the most important thing. They were right that the universe is stranger than our instruments can fully account for. They were right that grief is real and persistent and needs room to exist. They were right that beauty and meaning are not luxuries but necessities. They were right that the moments of human life, birth, love, death, the extraordinary, ordinary moments in between deserve ceremony, deserve attention, deserve more than the merely practical. And they were right above all that, the desire to connect with something beyond the visible, the desire that drove every séance, every stopped clock, every pinch of salt thrown into the dark is not a weakness of human nature. It is the best part of it. Thank you. Truly. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, through all these hours of Victorian parlours and magic and grief and birds and beetles and gold brooches made from the hair of people long gone, then you are my kind of person. You are someone who takes the strange and ancient seriously, who thinks the ordinary contains extraordinary things if you know how to look. I want to hear from you. Scroll down to the comments and tell me which part of this story surprised you the most. Was it the Fox sisters, the Death Watch beetle, the wedding rhyme you have been performing your whole life without knowing why? Was it the way the Victorians built entire systems to keep the people they loved present after they were gone? Tell me. I genuinely want to know. And if this story found you in a place where you needed something slow and thoughtful, if you stumbled onto this at 2 a.m, or on a quiet Sunday, or during a time when the world felt too loud and too fast, and you just needed somewhere to rest, I am glad you were here. I hope it gave you something worth carrying. Before you drift off tonight, there is one last small thing I want to say. The next time you knock on wood or throw salt over your shoulder or say bless you to a stranger in a supermarket without thinking about it, take 1 extra second and let yourself feel what that gesture is. It is not superstition. It is memory. It is the accumulated weight of every human being who ever stood in uncertainty reach for something to hold on to, and found that the reaching itself was enough. You are part of a very long story, and it is a beautiful one. Sleep well. Our next journey together will take us somewhere equally extraordinary, a place in history where the ordinary rules of power, beauty and survival were rewritten by people who had almost nothing and changed everything. I am so looking forward to exploring it with you. Until then, take good care.